Chapter 510. It was the night of August 17th. Reykjavik City was in chaos. The whole of Eastern Europe was in turmoil. In the capital of Snow Country, in the Holy Gorian Church, Patriarch Rock, who was the most low-key of the 4 patriarchs of the Eastern Church, had been praying for nearly 4 hours. The thick Bible was turning slowly and gently in front of him. The light in the prayer room was dim. The compassionate and holy statue looked extremely majestic. In front of the statue, Patriarch Rock knelt humbly and looked extremely pious. The Holy Gorian Church was not the largest church in Snow Country. It was not even the largest church in the capital of Snow Country. However, Patriarch Rock, one of the 4 patriarchs of Eastern Europe, was stationed here. In the hearts of all the Eastern Church believers, the Holy Gorian Church could be said to be the most sacred place. Patriarch Rock's prayer and Patriarch Hustiel's action began almost at the same time. Patriarch Hustiel led the elites of the Eastern Church south into Reykjavik City. Patriarch Rock was praying for the future of all of Eastern Europe. The Holy Gorian Church was heavily guarded. Countless elites of the Eastern Church surrounded the entire church motionlessly. The closer they got to the center of the church where the Patriarch prayed, the fewer people there were, but their strength was getting higher and higher. There were only 2 guards guarding near the prayer room, but they were all famous experts at the peak of the thunder-shocking realm in Eastern Europe. The Eastern Church was indeed not as strong as the Vatican, which was famous all over the world, but no one dared to say that the Eastern Church was weak. The sphere of influence of the Eastern Church was mainly concentrated in the countries of Eastern Europe, and most of the believers were Eastern Church believers. For many years, even the Vatican had not been able to influence this place. This alone was enough to show the strength of the Eastern Church. There were no experts at the peak of the invincible realm in the Eastern Church, but in terms of foundation and comprehensive strength, at least in Eastern Europe, they could be completely fearless. His Highness Rorance and our allies have a great advantage. According to the latest news, they have suppressed the Snowdance Corps and the Vatican. The whole process is very smooth. Your Excellency Bolet, congratulations. The 2 guards outside the prayer room stood quietly like sculptures. In the silent atmosphere, the older guard suddenly turned his head to look at his colleague and congratulated him with a smile. Bolet was a little thin. He wore the armor of the Eastern Church, and his entire face was hidden in the helmet, so it was unclear. But as the other party spoke, his eyes suddenly lit up with excitement. That excitement quickly calmed down. Bolet bowed respectfully and said softly, "All of this is because of Captain Giro's care and concern for me. Thank you, I will never forget everything you have done for me." Giros laughed with a happy and relaxed expression. He stretched out his hand and patted Bolet on the shoulder, saying softly, "Now you should consider who you want to take to Reykjavik City. Of course, if you don't have a suitable candidate, I can recommend someone for you." Under the helmet, Beauregard lowered his head and said calmly, "Thank you very much, leader." Giros smiled and narrowed his eyes. The look in his eyes became more and more satisfied. The Eastern Church also had something similar to the Holy Disarmament Corps. In the establishment of the Eastern Church, such a department was called the Knights of Light. There were 4 patriarchs in the Eastern Church. The Honorable Martial Banner of Knights had 4 commanders. Captain Giros was the commander of the knights who served Patriarch Rock. He controlled a quarter of the power of the Knights of Light, and Bolet was his most important deputy. Among the 4 patriarchs, Rock and Patriarch Hustiel had a very good personal relationship. Before this action, the 2 patriarchs had reached a consensus. In the Battle of Reykjavik City tonight, if the Eastern Church could suppress the Vatican and the Snowdance Corps, the Eastern Church would establish a branch of the Knights of Light in Wulan State in an extremely strong manner, which could also be said to be a subordinate agency. For example, the relationship between Knights Templars and the Vatican. The new agency was called the Knights of Light, composed of elites led by Rock and Patriarch Hustiel, and a small number of elite warriors of the other 2 patriarchs. Deputy Commander Bolet was the commander of the Knights of Light that both Rock and Patriarch Hustiel thought highly of. The geographical location of Wulan State was extremely sensitive and special. If the Knights of Light were established, they would shoulder a very important mission from the moment of its establishment. Reykjavik City was the main road between Eastern Europe and Western Europe, and the military would fight for it. Tonight, if Patriarch Hustile could expel the Vatican and the Snowdance Corps, once the Knights of Light were established, Bullitt would become one of the most important figures in the entire Eastern Church. His status was no less than that of the 4 commanders of the Holy Punishment Knights, or even higher, because everyone knew that the Eastern Church's ambition was more than that. The Dark World had been too calm before, and the Vatican had been too strong, so the Eastern Church could only stay dormant in Eastern Europe. But tonight, the Eastern Church and Rothschild had joined forces, and the Violet and Morton families had joined in. As long as they could win tonight, the Qing clan and Rekvia in Eastern Europe would inevitably suffer heavy losses. The Snowdance Corps would also withdraw from Eastern Europe in embarrassment, and the strength of the Vatican would also be greatly damaged. Even if Arcis was lucky enough to survive, there was no need for Paul, who had exposed his strength, to continue to hide. At that time, the Knights of Light would use Wulon State as the foundation, unite Rothschild and the wealthy families of Eastern Europe, and march westward at the same time to take down the Vatican. That was a game that was destined to be magnificent. As long as they thought about it, everyone in the Eastern Church could feel their blood boiling. There was a flash of complacency in Jiros's distant and deep eyes. No matter what the final outcome of this game was, as long as the Knights of Light could be established in Wulon State, he would become the most powerful of the 4 knight commanders. Because Bullitt was his man. A cold wind suddenly blew through the deep courtyard of the church. The cold wind blew into the prayer room, and the lights flickered for a moment. In the prayer room, the slight sound of pages turning stopped. The change was very small. Jiros didn't care. A cell phone suddenly rang. Jiros glanced down at the screen and answered the call. What? The person on the other side of the phone just reported, but Jiros suddenly exclaimed. His face changed dramatically, and he didn't come to his senses for a while. After a long time, he took a deep breath, suddenly turned around and strode to the prayer room. Chief Knight, Bullitt shouted subconsciously. I want to see the Patriarch. I have something very important to report. He pushed open the door of the prayer room. The lights were dim. The Patriarch knelt there, facing the statue. The Bible was open, but the pages were not turning. Jiros's heart was in a mess. But he still suppressed the anger in his heart and slowly said, Patriarch, I'm sorry to disturb your prayer, but I have something very important to report to you. The Patriarch knelt there motionless. Patriarch. Jiros called again. The Patriarch's head seemed to have lost its support and slowly drooped. Jiros's heart suddenly sank to the bottom. He suddenly took a step forward and rushed directly to the Patriarch's side. Everything in his line of sight caused his eyes to become completely lifeless. The Patriarch closed his eyes. Blood was slowly flowing out of his chest. The dark red color soaked the red robe, which looked extremely strange. There was a dagger in his heart. A fatal stab. Jiros suddenly felt that it was extremely absurd. He couldn't even believe what he saw. Another cool breeze blew in his face. The wind was very soft. But the faint killing intent suddenly became extremely condensed. A subtle, almost invisible lightning was blooming and spreading, light and swift. Jiros suddenly came back to his senses, and was instantly furious. Countless lightning bolts surged on his body for a moment. Damn it, whoosh! A huge force surged directly from behind Jiros before he could make a sound. Behind him, Bullitt, whom he had always trusted, suddenly stretched out his hand and firmly controlled his body. This kind of control lasted for a moment. But a moment was enough. A gentle but cold breeze blew into the lightning around his body. A cold but perfect palm appeared in the dim light. The luster of the dagger flashed in his sight. The palm swept past his neck. The blade of the dagger tore Jiros's throat in an instant. Warm blood suddenly splashed out and gushed out like a fountain. Jiros's eyes widened. Feeling the blood gushing out of the gap in his body, he suddenly understood the cause of the Patriarch's death. It was impossible for someone to hide here in advance and kill Patriarch Rock. It was even more impossible for someone to sneak into the heavily guarded church. The only possibility was that the killer was carefully brought in and arranged here. It wouldn't be long. It happened half an hour ago at most. And half an hour ago, he happened to leave once. Jiros gritted his teeth and turned his head. Blood spurted out of his neck. He opened his mouth, but he couldn't make a sound. Bullet, who had suppressed him for a moment at the critical moment, was looking at him quietly. There was no pleasure, helplessness, guilt, or complacency in his eyes. His eyes were calm. It could even be said that he was very devout. Bullet seemed to see what Jiro's wanted to ask. He drew a cross on his chest seriously and said calmly, "Have you heard of the Protestant Church?" Bang. Jiro's pupils dilated for a moment. His body fell to the ground and he died with his eyes open. The wind hidden behind the statue blew over and quickly disappeared in the prayer room. The breeze was invisible. It was invisible and silent. It was silent. The duties of the 4 patriarchs of the Eastern Church were extremely clear. Patriarch Heartfelt, who was ranked on the divine list and could be said to be the top expert in Eastern Europe, was responsible for fighting. Patriarch Rock, who was the most low-key and devout, was responsible for consolidating the believers' faith. Patriarch Calendar was the most high-profile. He was also the patriarch that everyone in Eastern Europe was most familiar with. He was responsible for the internal and external affairs of the Eastern Church. Patriarch Marika was the most mysterious and was responsible for preaching. They were the 4 patriarchs of Eastern Europe. In the list of heresies of the Vatican, the importance of the 4 patriarchs could be said to be second only to Raphael, the leader of the Dark Knights. They were also the 4 most famous heresies in the heart of the Vatican. The strongest Heartfelt was defined as a killer by the Vatican. He was responsible for all the fighting affairs of the Eastern Church. And he was indeed the patriarch with the most blood on his hands. Rock, who was the most low-key but responsible for the core believers' faith, was defined as a controller. His brainwashing work was extremely successful even in the eyes of the Vatican. Countless fanatics were the biggest obstacle to the Vatican's conquest of Eastern Europe. Calendar, who was responsible for the internal and external affairs of the Eastern Church, was defined as a destroyer. The Vatican had never given up on Eastern Europe, but every time it infiltrated, it was eventually destroyed by Calendar. To some extent, he was a big heretic that the Vatican hoped to get rid of the most. Marika, who was responsible for preaching, was defined as a conspirator by the Vatican. In the field of religion, the preaching of the Eastern Church was equivalent to a war in the eyes of the Vatican. Such preaching was not simply about spreading faith. Specifically, how to weaken the strength of the Vatican. Developing his own believers was Marika's field of work. Tonight, when the battle in Reki City broke out, Patriarch Marika was holding an extremely mysterious meeting in a small city in the south of Wulan state. Marika did not think that Heartfelt would lose. He firmly believed that Wulan state would become an area controlled by the Eastern Church before the sun rose tomorrow. So in order to set off a religious war in the shortest time, the Patriarch summoned his 6 godsons at once. Without exception, all 6 godsons came from Europe, but not from Eastern Europe. France, England, Italos, the empire where the sun never sets, and Germany. 5 godsons came from these 5 countries, and they were all leaders of a certain wealthy family in their respective countries. And the last godson came from the Vatican. This was Marika's proudest achievement in recent years. After the Eastern Church occupied Reki City, the Morton family, the Violet family, and Rothschild would go all out to cooperate with them and spread the war of faith to the whole of Europe. These 6 godsons from Europe naturally had their own missions, and they were all extraordinary missions. He was a conspirator in the eyes of the Vatican, and he was best at conspiring. The meeting lasted for nearly 3 hours. Marika almost detailed every step of the operation. After confirming that there was no mistake, he ended the meeting. The 6 godsons left one after another. Patriarch Marika waited for a while before slowly walking out of the conference room. The venue of the meeting was not any secret place in the Eastern Church, but the only 5-star hotel in the city. 4 knights stood neatly outside the room. Among them, Knight Tangminger, one of the 4 commanders of the Knights of Light, was also there. Seeing Patriarch Marika walk out of the room, Knight Tangminger bowed slightly. "Let's go back." Patriarch Marika smiled faintly. His voice was soft and magnetic, carrying an extremely powerful appeal. Tangminger nodded and led the way, while the other 3 knights followed behind. The night was getting darker. It was quiet in the corridor of the hotel. In the warm light, light footsteps sounded. A tall woman walked over. Her skin was fair, but it was not the kind of white that Europeans had. She looked like a Eurasian, and her golden hair swayed gently as she walked. The woman's pace was very lazy, but it was extremely enchanting. Tang Mingar looked at the woman's gently twisting body, and his eyes flashed with passion. The woman's appearance could not be regarded as a character, but she was very charming, and her every move was very seductive. Tang Mingar's eyes were a little hot. In such a serious scene tonight, he suddenly thought of a few Eastern European noble ladies with whom he maintained a private relationship. Tang Mingar shook his head in self-mockery, suppressed his inner desire, and glanced at the woman opposite him. Before the feeling of pity in his heart had subsided, a huge shock had already arisen. In his line of sight, the very elegant and feminine girl suddenly stopped in her tracks. Her eyes widened, and she looked behind them with a face full of horror. Tang Mingar instinctively sensed that something was wrong. Suddenly, a strange sound rang out from behind. The four knights turned around at the same time. A woman in a hotel uniform pushed a dining cart over, and her speed kept increasing. "Kill her!" Tang Mingar suddenly shouted and rushed to the dining cart without hesitation. The three knights beside him followed him instinctively. "Go!" A weak voice suddenly sounded. But this voice sounded like thunder in Tang Mingar's ears. It was the voice of Patriarch Marika. However, the voice stopped abruptly. Tang Mingar suddenly turned around. In his sight, the woman who had covered her mouth with a frightened face put down her hand. A steel needle fell out of his sleeve. His palm was slender but extremely thick. It was clearly a man's palm. A thought flashed across Tang Mingar's mind. Before he could move, the assassin who was dressed as a woman but looked so lifelike had already gotten close to Marika. The steel needle in his hand pierced through Marika's heart without hesitation. Countless electric arcs burst out in front of Marika's chest. They passed through his back and swept toward Tang Mingar with a large amount of blood. Tang Mingar pressed the alarm button in his hand and moved forward without hesitation. Puff! A shining tip of a sword pierced through his body from behind. The three knights beside the dining cart had already fallen. The woman in the uniform of a waiter held a long sword and pierced his heart. The assassin who killed Patriarch Marika took off his wig, mask, and women's clothes. The chaotic footsteps sounded. Countless knights of the Eastern Church rushed over. But he had completed the task and didn't care at all. Tang Mingar slowly fell down. A second before his life ended, he heard a voice. "Your Highness Li Tianlan sends his regards to the Eastern Church." The drifting clouds were formless, fearless and fearless, free and unrestrained. The ruins in front of the Caesar Hotel had completely disappeared. Everything in the surroundings had been completely erased from the intense battle. The originally bustling street was empty. The world was dead silent. The wreckage of the corpses was scattered everywhere. The blood spread into a river and flowed under their feet. The rain was still falling. On the ground, the blood-colored ripples kept spreading, which looked vivid and strange. Arsis, an expert at the peak of the invincible realm of the Vatican, was already covered in blood. He sat alone in the corpse-strewn battlefield, panting heavily. In this spacious and silent world, his panting was extremely ear-piercing, sounding extremely gloomy. In his sight, everyone had fallen down and turned into corpses. Only he was still alive. In the empty city, a lonely person. In the distant sky, it was raining wildly. Arsis gasped and was in a daze. At this moment, he suddenly felt extremely lonely, as if he was standing at the highest point of the world. His whole body seemed to be filled with a kind of loneliness from the inside out. Arsis sat on the ground, took out a cigarette, and lit it. For a moment, he was at a loss. Everything that happened tonight could be said to be the fiercest battle he had ever encountered in his life. But when the battle was over and the result was clear, what he felt was not joy, but confusion. King Tong's body fell in front of him. The blood covered her enchanting blonde hair, which looked extremely dirty. Beside King Tong, Paul, who only had a head left, died with his eyes open, but there was no sound. Raphael, the commander of the Dark Knights, who had always been regarded as the biggest heretic by the Vatican, had his heart pierced by a sword. The murderous weapon, Dark Saint's spear, which was famous in the dark world, was in his hand at this time. The body of the master of Samsara Palace lay there in the distance, a little blurred. Arsis had always been curious about the master of Samsara Palace. But now that the battle was over, he suddenly didn't want to take a look at her. Situd Songyua died beside the master of Samsara Palace. And in front of the lord of Sai City, Tribulation's body was split in half. The famous sword was still sharp. But Qin Shilai had become flesh and blood all over the sky. Countless corpses spread out from under Arisis's feet. Charlemagne, the president of the Heroes Club, Mitchell, Cassrotter, Huan Kong, Melad, Violet, Lagos and Hastile. All the invincible realm experts who could be named had turned into corpses. A little farther away, Lin Fengting, the patriarch of the Lin clan, also lay there quietly without a sound. Arsis suddenly laughed. Everything tonight broke out in chaos and abruptness. In the battlefield of the Caesar Hotel, their side had an absolute advantage, and his arrival made the victory completely tilted to their side. Without any hesitation, Arsis did his best to attack as soon as he arrived. He killed Paul in the shortest time, and then killed the invincible realm experts of the Violet family and the Morton family. The heretic Hastile, who was known as the Slaughterer in the eyes of the Vatican, surrendered to his power. And the Heroes Club Fantasy World, the Men in Black and even the Snowdance Corps were all badly injured. After the coronation, Arsis, who was at the peak of his strength, did not hesitate to cooperate with the Snowdance Corps and kill Charlemagne, the president of the Heroes Club. Cassrotter and Huan Kong also died under his absolute power. When only the Snowdance Corps was left on the battlefield, it was hard to say who would make the first move. The battle broke out without warning. In the end, Arsis killed all the strong enemies, including Lin Fengting, the patriarch of the Lin clan. His strength completely transformed in the high-intensity battle, and went further from the peak of the invincible realm. Now he was still in the state of coronation. He had surpassed the peak of the invincible realm. In the state of coronation, he almost dared to fight with the real Chosen One. His current strength had even surpassed that of Pope Monlier, who was known as the greatest in hundreds of years. Arsis laughed maniacally. This is my dark world. I am the king of the dark world. The only king. Aha. The crazy laughter kept echoing. Near Arsis, a middle-aged man in a red robe quietly watched Arsis go crazy. There was undisguised mockery in his eyes. This was a middle-aged man about 50 years old. His handsome face was pale at this time, but his eyes were still calm. He quietly looked at Arsis, who was in a state of madness. His eyes were calm and motionless, like a statue. You should rest in your residence in the middle of the night. You shouldn't come here. A voice suddenly sounded and fell into the ears of the middle-aged man. It also fell into Arisis's ears. The extremely silent world was instantly filled with this voice. I shouldn't come here. Come here. Here. The echo was mighty and kept echoing between heaven and earth. Arisis's face suddenly changed. He suddenly looked up at the sky and said angrily, "Who is it? I've been looking for you for a long time." A hand fell on the middle-aged man's shoulder. A white figure seemed to come out of nothingness and stood beside the middle-aged man. The middle-aged man's face suddenly changed. Under the agitation of his emotions, he couldn't help but spit out a mouthful of blood. Puff! In Arisis's sight, heaven and earth suddenly shook. A bloody wind whistled past, and a rain of blood suddenly floated between heaven and earth. Arsis was stunned, and his eyes were a little blank. You! The middle-aged man stared at the white figure in front of him. He was very familiar with the dark world. So he had identified the other party's identity when he came out of nothingness without any power fluctuation. This was not the other party's martial arts. There was only one piece of clothing in the dark world that could have such a weird hiding ability. The Azure Dragon armor of Zhongzhou State. Naturally, there was only one person who could wear this suit. Azure Dragon of Zhongzhou State. Gong Sunqi. Are you playing a monkey here? Gong Sunqi looked at the middle-aged man in front of him. Are you Patriarch Calendar? What do you want? Calendar, whose face was pale, said slowly. His mind, which had been tense all this while, was completely shattered. At the same time, the world in front of Arsis turned upside down. The rain of blood disappeared. All the corpses also disappeared. The whole world was filled with the sound of wind and rain. The scene was empty and calm. Not far away, the roar caused by the fierce battle was faintly discernible. The battle did not stop. Arsis was a little confused. I don't want anything, Gong Sun-chi said blandly. Zhongzhou State says hello to you. He waved his hand. Bang. Calendar, who had exhausted all his physical strength, directly exploded into a cloud of blood mist. Gong Sun-chi watched the blood mist drift away expressionlessly. He suddenly looked up at Arsis and asked curiously, after the Pope's coronation, can you also be hypnotized? The corner of Arisis's mouth twitched, and his eyes became ashamed and furious in an instant. It was not until this moment that he realized what had happened. But this should not have happened at all. After the Pope's coronation, his will should have been extremely focused. But how could he be hypnotized by Calendar tonight and fall into his trap? Arsis looked around. The corpses around him disappeared. But everything around him was indeed extremely empty. All the buildings around him were completely razed to the ground by the tremendous force. There was no doubt that this was Arisis's masterpiece. In the state of hypnosis, all the enemies in front of Arsis were really strong. The fierce battle made him squander his strength without reservation. But in fact, he had been standing here by himself, showing his strength at the peak of the invincible realm to the air and the surrounding buildings. When the absurd emotions rose, all Arsis could feel was awkwardness. How is this possible? He didn't know why he was hypnotized in the state of coronation. But at this time he could clearly understand his state. In the illusion of hypnosis, all the enemies he met were really strong. After waking up from the confusion of squandering his power, Arisis's physical strength and willpower had fallen to the lowest point. At this moment, Arsis could even feel that the concentrated will of the Pope's coronation began to slowly decline. His peak period had been wasted by Calendar in the hypnosis. How was this possible? Puff. A mouthful of blood spurted out of Arisis's mouth. The blood on the corners of his mouth in anger directly affected his excessive injury, and Arisis's momentum suddenly dropped a lot. Gong Sun-chi's heart sank a lot. Arsis, who had almost no combat power in this state, was not at the peak of the invincible realm. Damn it! Arsis suddenly clenched his fists and growled. The heretics of the Eastern Church deserve to die. There is another patriarch of the Eastern Church on the battlefield less than 5 kilometers away from here. Gong Sun-chi's voice was complicated. But in your current state, what can you do? Chapter 5:11. The emotions in Gong Sun-chi's tone were so complicated and tangled. Arsis could clearly hear the complexity in his words. It was contempt, disappointment, and disbelief. It was a lot of emotions that Arsis had never felt before. Almost in an instant, Arsis completely calmed down. Everything was a little abnormal tonight. Among the 4 patriarchs of the Eastern Church, Patriarch Rock, the most low-key and pious controller, had profound attainments in the spiritual field. But now it seemed that Patriarch Calendar, the Destroyer, was no worse than Patriarch Rock in the spiritual field. This was a spiritual attainment close to the transcendent realm. If it got out, it would be enough to cause a stir in the dark world. Arsis had no time to think about these questions. The only thing he wanted to know was how he was hypnotized. He had been crowned by the Pope, and his spiritual will was flawless. The greatly improved willpower also made him more focused on using his power, so that his strength could leap again on the basis of the peak of the invincible realm. Strictly speaking, he could not be hypnotized after the Pope was crowned. It was impossible for Calendar to do this in any case. But in fact, the most impossible thing had happened. He had fought endlessly in the illusion set up by Calendar, wasted all his physical strength, and was even seriously injured. In the illusion, he was invincible and stood at the peak of the world. But Gong Sun-chi pulled him back to the cruelest and coldest reality. The street was empty and calm. The buildings destroyed by Arisis's great power turned into ruins and piled up on the ground. The roar of the battle in the distance was endless. Feeling the sense of weakness and powerlessness coming from all over his body, Arisis's face was ugly and cold. "How's the situation?" he asked suddenly. If Rothschild was destroyed tonight, many stories were bound to happen. But now Rothschild was still there. and Arcis had been trapped here for an unknown period of time. Under such circumstances, the Vatican and the Snowdance Corps were naturally still allies. We lost, Gong Sun-chi said calmly. In the battle tonight, the biggest accident was naturally that Paul exposed his strength that was infinitely close to the peak of the invincible realm. It was also an accident that Arcis, who was crowned by the Pope, was hypnotized by Patriarch Calendar. Gong Sun-chi saw very clearly that Arcis had clearly fallen into an illusion and could not extricate himself. If he had not come, this block could be regarded as the spiritual world of Patriarch Callan. If he had come a little later, Arcis would have been at risk of dying. The suppression in the spiritual realm was far more tragic than that of martial arts. Arcis could not distinguish between illusion and reality. In the end, he could only fall in the illusion with an unparalleled sense of accomplishment. The Patriarch of Eastern Europe was almost lucky enough to kill the expert at the peak of the invincible realm of the Vatican that night. What did this mean? Gong Sun-chi knew very well that there was definitely something wrong with it. But the question was no longer important. The most important thing was that Arcis couldn't appear on the battlefield immediately, so the entire battle began to tilt in favor of Rothschild. Lost, Arcis raised his thick eyebrows and roared in a low voice. But the battle is not over yet. Does it matter? Mitchell, Huan Kong and Cass Rotter have all died. Qin Shilai and Tribulation have also been seriously injured and left the battlefield. Now on that battlefield, Violet, Lagos, and Hustiel have teamed up with King Tong Paul to kill the elites of several major forces. The battle is indeed not over yet. That's because the army of Wulon State has not been killed. What about you? What can you do in your current state? Aracis's face was pale. Every time Gong Sun-chi said a word, his heart sank a little. By the time Gong Sun-chi finished speaking, the Saint War Angel of the Vatican's heart had sunk to the bottom. In any case, he did not expect that the situation of this war had become so serious. The Snowdance Corps and Wulon State will make their last efforts. But if the general trend is really irresistible, at the last moment, Zhongzhou State can only choose to give up Wulon State. As for the Vatican, Gong Sun-chi's eyes were cold and indifferent. Take care of yourself. The night wind blew over. Arcis suddenly felt a chill all over his body. But after all, he did not completely lose the ability to think. Gong Sun-chi's few words had already painted a picture of the battlefield and the future for him. You mean Violet, Morton, and the Eastern Church are joining hands with Rothschild? Gong Sun-chi did not speak and turned around expressionlessly. Aracis's eyes turned cold. At this moment he did not think of Gong Sun-chi's rudeness, but the consequences if he lost the war tonight. The Snowdance Corps occupied Wulon State. Such a great advantage made Li Tianlan directly trigger the war tonight. Therefore the Snowdance Corps could not afford to lose. Li Tianlan and the Li family could not afford to lose. Once they lost the war tonight, Li Tianlan and the Li family would be under tremendous pressure. But in the current situation, the Vatican could not afford to lose either. Rothschild, the Eastern Church, Violet and Morton. Once the four of them occupied Wulon State together, and took advantage of Wulon State to move westward, the elites of the entire Eastern Church could directly attack the Holy Land. The cooperation of the four forces could be said to be flawless. Rothschild could provide an incomparable foundation in Western Europe, and Paul was an absolute master who could restrain Arcis. The identity of the Eastern Church could always limit this invasion to the scope of a religious war, and it could also use the doctrines of the Eastern Church to influence the believers of the Vatican. The doctrines from the same Bible, even if there were differences, how big could they be? The Morton family could provide absolute wealth. Violet could use the unlimited political resources of Snow Country as a bargaining chip. It was not that the Vatican could not withstand such a lineup, but the significance of this matter did not lie in whether the Vatican could withstand it or not. For the Vatican, as long as the Eastern Church stepped into Western Europe, every time they developed a believer, it was a failure of the Vatican. At that time, the mystery of the Vatican and the majesty of the Saint War Angel would become a joke. Arcis hated it when someone made fun of him. Although he became a joke tonight, only Gong Sun-chi could see it. If the Vatican failed tonight, his joke would be seen by the whole world. Aracis's eyes became colder and colder. Do you look down on me? He asked suddenly. Gong Sun-Chi's figure was about to disappear under the cover of the azure dragon armor. Hearing this, his figure paused slightly and turned around again. What you did tonight is not worthy of respect. Gong Sun-Chi said calmly. At least as an ally, I can't understand. Arceus nodded. His expression was serious and calm. This is an accident, but everything can be reversed. A crimson pill appeared in his hand. The pill was dark and scarlet, looking extremely strange. Without any hesitation, Arceus swallowed the pill. The red pill melted in his mouth, and then it was like a fire that suddenly burned. The burning feeling flowed down his throat and burned his whole body. Arceus's body trembled violently, as if he was suffering great pain. His pale face turned ruddy in an instant, and an unparalleled violent momentum burst out. The domain of the peak of the invincible realm began to condense toward him. In an instant, a gust of wind was set off on the empty street. Gong Sun-Chi stood on the edge of the domain. He was the strongest superior of the half-step invincible realm under the invincible realm, and he had the strongest combat capability of the invincible realm. Even if Li Tianlan rose, Gong Sun-Chi was still the strongest under the invincible realm. But the strongest superior of the half-step invincible realm couldn't help but shake under the fluctuation of this domain, and he seemed to be a little unstable. Arceus closed his eyes and endured the pain in his body that almost tore his soul apart. The extremely violent effect lasted for about 10 minutes. Arceus slowly opened his eyes. His eyes were calm, and his aura was completely calm. Let's go. Arceus glanced at Gong Sun-Chi. Let's go and have a look. This is... Gong Sun-Chi opened his mouth, but he didn't finish his words. In the Dark World, there were many gene potions that could support experts to fight in various environments. Among them, there were many magical drugs that could temporarily restore the combat capability of seriously injured people. In many cases, this often meant another extra life. But such drugs were often only suitable for those below the invincible realm. There were very few drugs that could make an invincible realm expert recover from his injury and return to the peak state in an instant, and they were often accompanied by various sequelae, such as blurred willpower, confusion of friends and foes, and the more serious ones might even lower the realm. But the red pill in Arceus's hand obviously had no restrictions. He who had returned to the peak state in an instant could distinguish between friends and foes. In such a situation, he dared to take the pill, which even showed that he didn't need to pay too much later. Such a drug should be a treasure even in the Wang family of Beihai, which had the most powerful gene potion technology. The Vatican's research in this regard was not as good as that of the Wang family of Beihai, and compared with other developed countries, it had no advantage. What kind of drug was this? This is the latest achievement of the Vatican. There is only one of it, and it's with me. The muscles at the corners of Arceus's mouth twitched. This red pill was naturally not as good as the immortality potion, but it could make a seriously injured expert at the peak of the invincible realm return to the peak combat capability in an instant, which was enough to show how powerful it was. The code name of this medicine, Redemption, could be said to be the highest achievement of the Vatican in this regard. This was originally one of Arceus's trump cards. In his plan, this should have been the trump card to face Wang Tianzong in the final decisive battle in the chaos of Eastern Europe. But now, because of the Eastern Church, this redemption was wasted here. Because he couldn't afford to lose. Tonight, it was even more impossible for him to withdraw from Wulan State and let the Eastern Church enter Western Europe to touch the Holy Land. These heretics really deserved to die. Arceus narrowed his eyes, and there was infinite killing intent in them. At this moment he did not deliberately show his strength, but he stood there, and he was already indomitable. Gong Sun-Chi took a deep look at Arceus. After a long time he bowed slightly and said, Gong Sun-Chi pays respect to your highness. Arceus did not speak. The suffocating sense of oppression in the field was still there. However, his figure had already disappeared. Gong Sun-Chi stood up and looked at the sky. In the night, a violent and ostentatious killing intent roared and surged all the way away. Gong Sun-Chi was silent for a long time before he slowly turned around. A gentle and quiet voice suddenly sounded behind him without warning. The voice was very, very close behind Gong Sun-Chi. Third brother. Did you kill Callant? Gong Sun-chi's face changed dramatically, and he suddenly turned around. The surprise attack of freezing Snow City was like a real war. After the fighting, the explosion, and the flying blood fell, the sword light retracted, and the vast manor returned to peace. The war broke out abruptly. It also ended abruptly. In the Battle of Reki City, Violet took away more than 60% of the elite forces of the Violet family. In order to maintain the stability of Snow City, some of the experts in the manor were scattered all over the city. The most important thing was that the departure of Violet himself made the Violet family lose its most powerful deterrent. Under such circumstances, the sharpness of the Xianyuan sword troop was almost completely released from the very beginning. The pulse weapons cleared the field as soon as possible, and the remaining experts were few after the first charge of the Xianyuan sword troop. The heavenly fairy of Ling Shuangxue, the first elder of Jade Pool, blocked the counterattack of the fog defense system of the Violet family's headquarters. This was just the beginning. As soon as an expert of the half-step invincible realm and an expert at the peak of the thundershocking realm of the Violet family appeared, a sword strike that was more ruthless and decisive than the heavenly fairy had already broken out inside the manor. The famous sword snowblowing, heaven-shattering rainbow. With just one sword strike, the two strongest experts of the Violet family who stayed at the headquarters tonight had been smashed into pieces. From the attack to the patriarch of the Violet family, the raid of Xianyuan sword took less than half an hour from beginning to end. On this night, the most important figures of the Supreme Violet family in Snow Country were all exposed to the sharpness of the Jade Pool. Without any defensive measures, when facing death, the rich and powerful families were also trembling with fear. The blood beads on the snowblowing flowed down and dripped on the expensive carpet. Su Chang'e, who had only made one sword strike in the whole war, quietly looked at the crowd crawling at his feet. The patriarch of the Violet family, Tovo Granaski Violet, and all the important figures of the Violet family in the headquarters. The old patriarch of the Violet family, who was paralyzed in bed at the age of 80. Tovo's two younger sisters. An elder brother. In addition, there were a few children who looked no more than 5 or 6 years old. At this moment, all the members of the Violet family were huddled together, looking at Su Chang'e with undisguised fear and hatred in their eyes. Mr. Su, a captain of the Xianyuan sword troop, came over and said expressionlessly, "I've checked. In addition to the Violet family, there are 8 other members of the Violet family who are not here. They are all very important figures, and 2 of them are in Snow City. Send someone to kill them." Su Chang'e said in a flat tone. The captain nodded, turned around, and went to deploy. Su Chang'e's eyes fell on Tovo, the patriarch of the Violet family. He was silent for a while before he said calmly, "So in tonight's raid, we actually only captured you, the most valuable hostage. There's nothing we can't talk about." Tovo took a deep breath. He was still in his pajamas. When the Xianyuan sword troops raided the manor, he happened to take off the clothes of a young female counselor, who had recently been trained to be very obedient. He waved his hand, stood up tentatively, and said slowly and sincerely, "People of China, the Violet family is very willing to be friends with you. We can talk, we can talk. I can call my wife now. She will come back with the elites of the family. No, she can even help you. You want to deal with Rothschild? Violet can help you." A member of the Xianyuan sword army came over, took a photo, and then retreated. "You can't kill me. It will destroy the relationship between Snow Country and Zhongzhou State. If we cooperate, all of Eastern Europe will be ours. Your young marshal has great power. He is a strong man. I'm willing to share Eastern Europe with the strong. Time will prove that cooperating with the Violet family is the best choice." Su Chang'e glanced at the elite who had just retreated. The other side nodded expressionlessly. Su Chang'e also nodded and glanced at Tovo. "Are you done?" Tovo's pupils shrank sharply. "Time will prove that killing you tonight is the best choice," Su Chang'e said calmly. The snow-blowing sword made a very bright arc of light in the air. The arc of light flashed and then disappeared. A few drops of blood splashed out. A line of blood suddenly bloomed on Tovo's throat. The blood spurted out, looking strange and bloody. What right does a patriarch who is willing to hand over the power of the family to a woman have to talk about cooperation? Su Chang'e said indifferently. There was a sudden exclamation in the gorgeous hall. The rest of the old people, children, and women all huddled together, shivering. Su Chang'e glanced at them. Senior brother, what should we do with these people? Ling Shuangxue came over and asked. Su Chang'e's eyes shifted from the children to the old people. There was a touch of hesitation in his eyes. I can't get in touch with His Highness now, he said slowly. Maybe these people can be used to threaten Violet. Ling Shuangxue did not speak. There were indeed 2 children born to Tovo and Violet, a boy and a girl. The boy was close to adulthood, and the girl was only 5 years old this year. It was a good choice to use to threaten Violet. But Li Tianlan didn't seem to think about this problem from the beginning. His order was very simple, that was to destroy the entire Violet family. No matter who won or lost the battle in Reki City tonight, the Violet family and the Morton family were bound to disappear in Eastern Europe. If the Snowdance Corps won, the Qing clan and Rekvia would get more and greater benefits in Eastern Europe in the future. Su Chang'e looked at the group of old, young women and children in front of him, and his eyes were a little shaken. He saw cowardice, fear, and hatred in their eyes. After all, he was just a swordsman who lived in Jade Pool and rarely went down the mountain. Now he had destroyed the Violet family, but in the face of this group of old, young women and children who had no power to fight back, he was at a loss for a moment. The elites of Xianyuan Sword slowly walked into the hall. They were also looking at this group of people who had no power to fight back, their eyes cold and silent. Su Chang'e suddenly felt a little sick. He shook his head hard and said, I'll make a phone call. Can't you get in touch with His Highness? Ling Shuangxue asked. Su Chang'e shook his head. I'll call Rushi. Maybe His Highness has other arrangements. The phone was quickly connected. Dongqing Rushi's clear voice sounded very soft. Master? Su Chang'e's inner struggle gradually calmed down. He smiled and said gently, It's me. Dongqing Rushi said honestly, Tianlan is not here. How are things on your side? Everything is going well. Su Chang'e looked back at the crowded hostages, sighed softly, and said, I still have some old people and children of the Violet family in my hands. They are all very important people. Rushi, does His Highness have any other arrangements? Dongqing Rushi also fell silent. Obviously, she also understood the meaning of this sentence. Su Chang'e quietly waited for Dongqing Rushi's answer. They are all enemies. After a long time, Dongqing Rushi said softly. But these are old people and children. Su Chang'e subconsciously raised his voice. The youngest child is less than 2 years old this year. After all, he couldn't accept what might happen next, so he directly expressed his position. Dongqing Rushi was silent. There was silence on the other end of the phone. After a long time, in the silence, Dongqing Rushi hung up the phone. She didn't respond to Su Chang'e's words in the end. No response was actually a kind of response. Su Chang'e's body was a little cold. He stood there for a long time, then glanced at Ling Shuangxue and said in a low voice, Let's go. The 2 swordsmen of Mount Shu slowly walked out. The elites of the Xianyuan sword troop stood quietly. The temperature in the hall became gloomy and cold. The door slowly closed. A child's cry suddenly sounded in the room. Sword intent spread out in the hall. The screams lasted for a moment, and then disappeared. Su Chang'e didn't look back. He stepped on the flagstone road of the manor. Wherever he walked, a line of deep footprints was branded on the flagstone road, deep and clear. Senior brother, Ling Shuangxue hesitated. Su Chang'e slowly shook his head and suddenly said, Let's go back. Ling Shuangxue was a little confused. She opened her charming and extremely moving eyes wide. Go back to Zhongzhou State, Su Chang'e said in a low voice. He straightened his body and subconsciously looked in the direction of Reki City. In Reki City, Dongqing Rushi stood in front of the window and looked at the extremely deep night outside. The screen of the phone that hung up completely dimmed. The wind and rain were messy. She stood quietly. In the distant sky, the deep night seemed to turn into an extremely dark shadow. The shadow slowly drifted over and seemed to completely envelop Dongqing Rushi. Yuzhou. In the gradually slanting sunlight, a black Rolls-Royce slowly drove into the hidden Dragon Sea and finally stopped in front of Jinxiu Pavilion. There was no secretary in front of the solemn gate of Jinxiu Pavilion. President Li Huaqing of Zhongzhou State stood at the door and looked at the approaching Rolls-Royce with a smile. A silent woman with an extremely fierce aura quickly got out of the car and opened the back door of the Rolls-Royce. Summer Solstice, the wife of the patriarch of the Wang family of Beihai, walked out of the car and shook hands with Li Huaqing with a smile. She said softly, "Mr. President, sorry to bother you." "Madam, you don't have to be so polite." Li Huaqing shook his head with a smile and reached out his hand. "Please." The hostess of the Wang family of Beihai, who had never stepped into the hidden Dragon Sea for more than 20 years, smiled lightly. But there was a kind of sharpness that seemed to have been forgotten gradually coming out of her. She was dignified and elegant, but irresistible. At the same time, under the sky of Beihai, in the laboratory of Mount Dibing, beside the huge bronze tripod, Wang Xiaoyao, who had been silent for a long time in the dark world and even in Zhongzhou State, put a box in the bronze tripod with a solemn face. The gigantic coldness of the 9 states stood there quietly, but the natural sword qi broke through the extremely sturdy box without anyone activating it. A black arm guard came out of the box. The arm guard began to spread slowly, with unparalleled spirituality, and wrapped around the coldness of 9 states. The broad body of the coldness of 9 states suddenly buzzed. In an instant, invisible but extremely sharp sword energy flew in every corner of the laboratory hall. Wang Xiaorao watched this scene quietly. The black sword kept trembling. On the body of the sword, the sun, moon, stars, mountains, rivers, lakes, and seas seemed to be alive and became extremely vivid. The sword energy became more and more violent, but it was extremely sharp and clear. Looking at this scene, Wang Xiaoyao suddenly felt a little emotional. This was the first fusion of the divine weapon and the murderous weapon of the Wang family of Beihai. At this moment, was the human emperor moving? Or was the coldness of 9 states moving? He pressed a button beside him. A light shield gradually rose from the huge bronze tripod. The misty blue light rose and gradually enveloped the human emperor and the coldness of 9 states. It was sunny in Linen. The former lonely mountain had become today's Southeast Supervisory Council. The main building of the Supervisory Council had been completed. The engineering corps from the Lin and military region were still repairing other facilities in the Supervisory Council day and night. Li Honghe, dressed in plain clothes, sat quietly on a bluestone in the Supervisory Council, facing West Lake, silently watching the sun gradually setting in the west. In the dim light and shadow, an old man with a serious and dignified expression appeared. Li Honghe was stunned and smiled softly. The old man was followed by a few meticulous guards. The guards didn't stop until they got close to Li Honghe. The old man came over and sat down beside Li Honghe. He wanted to say something but stopped on second thought. "Can't sit still." Li Honghe glanced at him and said with a soft laugh, "Reki City." The old man frowned tightly. "The situation is not good." "No, for us the situation tonight is the best." Li Honghe smiled and suddenly said, "Do you believe me or not?" The old man glanced at him and thought, "Is it nonsense?" Li Honghe seemed to have gotten the answer. He nodded and said, "Since you believe me, stay for dinner tonight. When this big show is over, everything should be clear." At the same time, it was almost evening in Zhongzhou State. In the strong wind and heavy rain at Reki City International Airport, Qin Weibai also boarded the plane to Lin in Zhongzhou State. There was no flaming fire beside her. There was no Lin Fengting. She was alone. Chapter 512. There was another chapter before last night at 12 o'clock. The situation took a turn for the worse in the blink of an eye. When the red light that filled the sky suddenly erupted and slowly dissipated, the situation of the entire battlefield became incomparably clear. However, Cass Rotter's sudden disappearance from the battlefield still gave everyone a clear sense of astonishment. Tonight, more than one invincible realm expert died in the battle. But Cass Rotter's death gave everyone a different feeling. It might even be completely different. Cass Rotter was the god of war of Star State. He was an expert who was close to the peak of the invincible realm. He ranked in the top 10 of the divine list, and held the murderous weapon holy punishment of void. In this state, Kasrater might not be able to sweep the dark world. But in the dark world he was absolutely fearless. No one expected him to fall here. And in such a strange way, a huge sense of confusion struck everyone's heart. It was not only Raphael, Mellad and Situd Sangyue who were stunned. Even Paul, King Tong, Violet, Lagos, and even Patriarch Hostile, who had been taken care of by the occupation, were stunned. At this moment, regardless of friend or foe, everyone felt a sense of sympathy. Kasrater was the most important person to fall tonight. His death was destined to cause a great disturbance in the dark world. Even Star State, which had been slowly increasing its national power in recent years, would be greatly impacted. Paul's expression was calm, but sweat flowed down the back of his head and into his collar. The weight of a murderous weapon was undoubtedly extremely heavy, especially the void divine punishment. Among the 12 malefic weapons, the holy punishment of void was not the most powerful, but that was under normal circumstances. In the past 10 years, the void godly punishment had not been fired even once. After accumulating energy for 10 years, the power of the holy punishment of void was definitely far beyond its normal state. At such a close distance, if this spear fell on Paul, he would be seriously injured on the spot, or even completely lose his combat capability. He would need a long period of recuperation in the future to save his life, and it was still unknown whether he could recover or not. This was the most normal situation. But now, the great danger had completely disappeared in a way that no one could have imagined. Paul did not feel relieved. Instead, he suddenly felt uneasy. Until now, he finally saw the situation of the dark world clearly. The Polar Ground Alliance collapsed. The balance of the four families was broken, which eventually led to the current chaos in Eastern Europe. Eastern Europe affects the whole world. Now that the chaos in Eastern Europe had not been pacified, Rothschild had completely become enemies with all the major forces. If Rothschild won tonight, Rothschild would inevitably gather the Shadow Throne with the general trend. Kyle would join forces with the Violet Morton family and cooperate with the Eastern Church to take down the Vatican. If Rothschild failed tonight, the Vatican would definitely attack Rothschild fiercely when it increased the speed of devouring the Eastern Church. The situation had already reached this point. After shedding all pretense of cordiality, there was no possibility of reconciliation between the two sides. From another perspective, in the chaos of Eastern Europe, Western Europe was bound to fall into extreme chaos after tonight, no matter who won or lost. Now that Kasrater, the god of war of Star Nation, and Huan Kong, the lord of Fantasy World, had died here at the same time, the vast North America was equivalent to losing two pillars overnight. North America would not be peaceful anymore. The probing of outsiders and the internal battles would also be exciting. Further south, South America. Jiang Qiansong was expelled from the Jiang family of South America. The Heroes Club had lost Mitchell. It was foreseeable that South America would not be peaceful either. As for Asia, as for Tiannan, it was the battlefield of the Wang family of Beihai and the purgatory of Heaven capital. But the land of Tiannan was involved in the sites of Zhongzhou State, East Island, and Annan State. Inside East Island, Jifeng Sword Reigning School and Wuji Palace were fighting against the purgatory of Heaven capital. Inside Zhongzhou State, the hidden danger of the Wang family of Beihai was becoming more and more obvious. With the rise of the Li family, the atmosphere in Zhongzhou State began to become strange. It was not until this moment that Paul was shocked to find that after the battle tonight, there was no pure land in the dark world. When all the superpowers began to become chaotic, some of the weaker ones would definitely feel that they had a chance to rise. After tonight, the whole dark world would fall into an incomprehensible chaos. Looking at the dark world in recent decades or even hundreds of years, it seemed that such a situation had never occurred. It was like the madness before the end of the world. The general trend had formed a vortex that swallowed the whole dark world with Eastern Europe as the core. There was no way to stop struggling in this vortex, whether it was people or forces. They could only go crazy hysterically. All of this was like a conspiracy without a purpose. Paul suddenly felt very cold inside. At this moment, at least tonight, Rothschild was already standing in the center of the vortex. The surging general trend was surging wildly. Under the general trend, Paul felt that he and even Rothschild were incomparably small. If all this was a conspiracy, then what did the person behind the scenes who made all this want? Paul's face turned a little pale unconsciously. Brother! King Tong let out a soft cry. Bang! Countless rays of light suddenly bloomed in front of him. The brilliant and scorching light was spinning wildly in front of him. The silent battlefield was completely broken in an instant. The light of heaven of Patriarch Hustile kept condensing in his hand, and dozens of thick light pillars kept falling. The moment the light pillars lit up, the crazy killing intent had already rushed to Situt Songyue. A huge black shield appeared in front of Situt Songyue at the same time. The Dark Saint's spear kept changing its shape in the violent light. Raphael could hardly communicate with Situt Songyue. The loud roar and ubiquitous attacks completely covered her in an instant. In the blazing white light, Violet and Lagos attacked at the same time, almost regardless of the cost. In such an obvious situation, everyone could clearly see one thing. If they killed Raphael and Situt Songyue, Reki City would be theirs. As for Mellad, who was the weakest, they didn't care about him anymore. The light completely drowned Raphael and Situt Songyue. The huge force fiercely hit the Dark Saint's spear, and Raphael could even hear the constant wailing of the Dark Saint's spear. In a hurry, Raphael's domain was opened with all his might. The world was silent for a moment, and Raphael quickly said, "Kill one first." Boom. Mellad attacked with all his might. He was originally standing behind Situt Songyue, but at this time, he took a step forward. Soft and pure light kept flowing out of his fingers. The light surged in the night sky and merged with the light of heaven. The pressure on the Dark Saint's spear was instantly reduced. The pure light formed a door in front of Raphael and Situt Songyue. The door turned into a wall, blocking all the attacks from all directions. The unique skill of the Vatican, refuge. Hurry up. The surging power crashed into Melad's body. Blood spurted out of Melad's mouth. His face was a little ferocious, and there was an obvious urge in his simple voice. In an instant, the Dark Saint's spear changed from a shield to a long saber. The long black saber spread wildly, and the pitch-black saber light instantly covered 100 meters. An incomparably sharp saber light shattered all the light in front of Hustile. The pitch-black saber light continued to move forward. It almost brushed past Hustile's body and directly slashed at Violet, who was the weakest among them. The saber light, which was dozens of meters long, locked onto Violet's figure. The domain and the saber light burst out at almost the same time. It was pitch black but dazzling. This move was called Dark Gospel. This move was called Death Harvest. All the power surged out of Raphael's body as he took a step forward. Blood began to seep out of the pores on his body, but as soon as the blood appeared, it was completely evaporated by the high temperature of his body. Raphael's eyes were ferocious. This was his most extreme move at the moment. It erupted in an instant, and it was as if he was either dead or alive. The saber light was surging. Wherever the pitch-black edge passed, the night sky seemed to be split in half, and all the air was crazily squeezed toward the surroundings. The space was distorted to the extreme. In the dull roar, it continued to explode and burn. The flames fell from the sky to the ground. On the ground, the major forces were still fighting. As the flames fell, an invincible realm expert of the Violet family was instantly burned to ashes. Violet's body was completely stiff. It wasn't that she didn't want to move, but that she couldn't move at all. Everything about her had been locked by Raphael. The domain was his will, and the saber light was his power. In a desperate situation, this move had reached the perfection that Raphael had never achieved. Violet couldn't move her body, nor could she use the domain. This desperate move completely showed the absolute suppression of an expert in the middle of the divine list against an expert in the middle of the holy list. Raphael's eyes were scarlet, and he was completely crazy. Not long ago, Tribulation's desperate move was not completely fruitless. He used the most direct and most dangerous method to detonate a space that was completely out of control. Needless to say, he was injured, but in that uncontrollable and unpredictable space, Paul was also seriously injured. The most important thing was that his physical strength had been greatly consumed. During the period when he almost didn't do anything but was recovering his physical strength, it was the best opportunity for Raphael. Without Violet, their pressure would be reduced to a considerable extent. Then they would have the hope of breaking out of the encirclement. Breaking out of the encirclement. Raphael gave a wry smile. He didn't even have time to sigh with emotion that the tables had turned. The saber in his hand had already been pressed down crazily. The saber slashed in the air. A crack could be clearly seen in the empty night sky. Raphael suddenly raised his head. In his sight, Paul stretched out his hand and grabbed at the air. Violet's body was suddenly torn by a huge force and pulled out of the domain. Without any hesitation, Raphael stabbed straight with his saber. Violet, who had gotten rid of the shackles, looked at Raphael with resentment and soared into the sky without hesitation. There seemed to be a meteor streaking across the distant sky. The meteor burned with flames and broke through the sky from the distant sky. Almost in the blink of an eye, a surging and violent force had filled the entire sky, and Violet had just risen. The falling meteor seemed to have found its target and directly crashed into Violet. The huge force brought up one storm after another, and the speed of the meteor suddenly accelerated. It was filled with killing intent, anger, and determination. Violet's pupils instantly widened. The meteor in her sight became clearer and clearer. At this moment, she could only scream, "No!" However, before he could finish his sentence, the meteor had already collided with Pooh. In Violet's sight, there was an extremely clear and profound figure. Bang! In Violet's incomparably shrill and desperate scream, the meteor rushed past her. Violet looked down at herself in a daze. The corner of her mouth moved. Puff! With a dull sound, her body was directly exploded by the huge force, and her whole body turned into a mist of blood. The meteor landed on the ground and looked at Paul quietly. King Tong was stunned for a long time before she suddenly exclaimed, "Arsis!" Chapter 5:13. The battle in the sky and on the ground did not subside with Violet's death. Instead, it became even crazier. The ink-like shadows in Paul's hands condensed into a substance and turned into countless swords, rushing towards Raphael without any pause. Melat stood together with Situtsangyue. Under the suppression of Patriarch Hustile, the pure light in the sanctuary continued to shrink and was almost completely gone. King Tong's domain completely enveloped the battlefield in the air. The space around Lagos was constantly twisting, as if it was accumulating power. The fighting on the ground seemed to be never-ending. The elites of Rothschild had already arrived at the battlefield. The elites of the Morton family, the Violet family, and the Knights Templar were also fighting. The army of Wulon State still seemed endless. The Masters of the Vatican, the Dark Knights, the Holy Disarmament Corps, the Heroes Club, the Fantasy World, and the Men in Black were fighting with the enemy under the cover of the army of Wulon State. Thunder and raging fire kept breaking out in the crowd, and the momentum was terrifying. However, it was only a frightening display. The combined power of the major forces on the ground was definitely stronger than the allies of Rothschild. However, experts of the invincible realm kept falling, which made the cooperation of the superpowers extremely chaotic. In addition, when Violet first appeared, he slaughtered the experts of the superpowers, which made everyone fearful when fighting. 3 of the 7 deadly sins of the Dark Knights, who were famous in the Dark World, had died in battle. More than half of the Holy Disarmament Corps of the Vatican died. Mitchell was the first invincible realm expert to die, so the elites of the Heroes Club had almost been wiped out. Fantasy World and the Man in Black were completely out of their wits. They were only subconsciously fighting each other. Erisis's figure fell heavily to the ground. An energy wave visible to the naked eye spread out violently with him as the center. The bodies of several knights of the Radiance Knight Regiment closest to him were directly shattered. Some of Violet's broken bones and flesh slowly fell to the ground, but they were fiercely scattered by this force. King Tong's exclamation rang out, but no one on the battlefield seemed to notice this scene. It wasn't that she didn't notice it. To be exact, she was already numb to it. Mitchell, Huan Kong, Cass Rotter, Violet. The general trend of the Dark World had never stopped. But throughout the history of the Dark World for nearly 100 years, there had never been a war that could make an invincible realm expert so fragile and fall so easily. From shock to numbness, now everyone had gone completely crazy. Erisis's eyes were cold and ruthless. A berserk aura surged around him. He fixed his eyes on several invincible realm experts for the first time. Paul immediately sensed a huge pressure coming at him. Erisis's voice rang out, shaking the sky and spreading out majestically. This voice was loud and sonorous, and its dignity carried undisguised brutality and rage. Heresy! You all guilty! Whoosh! Out of instinct, Raphael's power erupted in an instant. After temporarily getting rid of Paul's entanglement, he retreated without hesitation. He was the leader of the Knights of Darkness. His most well-known achievement in the Dark World was not how well he developed the Dark Knights, nor was it his past achievements that shocked the Dark World. The biggest thing he was known to have done was to be able to escape unscathed from Arsis after provoking the Pope in the European sanctuary. And that was the uncrowned Arsis. He knew how powerful Arsis was. Paul was also very powerful. Raphael didn't want to get involved in the battle between people of this level, not at all. His body glided through the air. Almost at the same time, Melad's body suddenly lit up. Countless pure flowing lights continued to condense. The defensive light wall in front of Melad was instantly thickened countless times, and was completely indestructible. This was not Melad's refuge. It was the unique skill to upgrade the refuge. Divine protection. Arsis, who had taken action to share Melad's pressure in the blink of an eye, appeared directly in front of Paul the moment the light appeared. He had no domain. However, the torrential power tore through the sky in an instant and shattered the shadows. His figure looked extremely tall and majestic in the process of charging. He was like a god. He was the Saint War Angel of the Vatican. And now, he was the Saint War Angel in a state of fury. One punch. In an instant, as Arsis waved his fist, the void within a radius of thousands of meters suddenly exploded. The extremely terrifying power came from all directions with a crazy tearing airflow. The domain that King Tong had condensed with all her strength suddenly shattered. Paul's body became clear for a moment. The pure light suddenly bloomed. Arsis, who was surrounded by holy light, punched Paul again. There was still no domain. There was still no sword intent. Erisis's movements were extremely simple and straightforward. Every move of his was filled with crazy surging power. He ranked first in close combat in the Dark World. He didn't need the so-called domain. No matter whose domain he was in, as long as he got close, his surroundings would be his world. King Tong's domain was completely suppressed. Puff. A mouthful of blood spurted out of King Tong's mouth, and her face instantly turned pale. Paul's body flashed in an instant. The domain around him condensed and spread, and it condensed with the domain that King Tong had burst out again. The obscure and dark shadow was mighty, and even the light on Erisis's body seemed to be no longer pure. When the two of them joined forces, this was the perfect domain. In this domain, Paul was also at the peak of the invincible realm. Erisis's body rushed straight forward, simple, violent. It looked very cumbersome, but it carried an unimaginable swiftness and fierceness. Shadow slaughter. The small shadow on Paul's body kept fluctuating, and his figure disappeared in an instant. The next second, Arsis turned around and hit him with his elbow without hesitation. Bang! It was like the most casual collision, but the solid space was like a fragile mirror that was shattered one after another. The light and the shadow were entangled wildly. A large area of the night sky turned into nothingness, and then fell into the purest darkness. Paul took 2 steps back. His face was slightly pale, but he steadied himself. Erisis's pupils shrank slightly, and he turned around and rushed to King Tong without hesitation. Paul was very strong, but King Tong was the key. King Tong's domain completely made up for the weakness of Paul's domain in the state of shadow slaughter, and then made his combat capability reach the peak of the invincible realm, which was not inferior to Erisis's. As long as he killed King Tong, Arsis was 100% sure that he could kill Paul tonight. The shadow fluctuated slightly. Paul seemed to have crossed the space and appeared directly in front of Arsis. Leg sweep. Forward punch. Throat lock. Around the back. In the shadow domain, Paul's body had completely turned into a dark optical fiber. His figure seemed to appear in all directions of Arsis at the same time. And the cold killing intent burst out from the trickiest angle. Arsis didn't dodge or evade. He attacked head-on, and all of Paul's attacks were taken by him. Forward. His footsteps were extremely firm. In Paul's crazy attack, he went straight forward and rushed to King Tong. Buzz. A buzzing sound suddenly rang out in the void that had become extremely chaotic, but had become incomparably quiet. Red light suddenly appeared. The blade of Ghost Hand appeared in front of Arsis almost in the blink of an eye. Bang! Arisis's body suddenly twisted, and he smashed his fist on the blade of Ghost Hand. The light that almost dispelled the whole night burst out in an instant. Arsis suddenly roared. An endless light burst out around him. The light that was condensed to the extreme suppressed the perfect domain created by Paul and King Tong. The shadow was retreating. The light was moving forward. It was so difficult to move forward and backward, but it obviously existed. A unique skill. The forbidden spell of heaven. This was a domain. But it was not Arisis's own domain. It was the strongest domain in the Vatican for hundreds of years, and it could also be said to be the most powerful unique skill. This was the unique skill of His Majesty Monlier, the greatest pope of the Vatican hundreds of years ago. Once the forbidden spell of heaven reached its limit, it had the terrifying power to kill someone at the peak of the invincible realm in an instant. At the peak of this unique skill, the Vatican even had clear records that its power was infinitely close to that of the Chosen One. Arisis's strength was far inferior to that of His Majesty Monlier in the past. But at this moment, this forbidden spell of heaven was already the domain of the peak of the invincible realm, and it was also his strongest trump card outside of close combat. End the battle as soon as possible. Tonight had brought Arsis too many surprises and humiliation. He didn't want to waste time with anyone. As long as King Tong died, everyone would die. Arsis roared wildly. A lot of blood flowed down from his body, but the situation that broke out soared again. Another ray of light that was slightly dimmer, but equally pure shot over from afar. Unique skill. Commandment of light. Under the circumstances that he couldn't reveal his true strength, this was Melad's strongest move. The pure light completely combined with the forbidden spell of heaven. The difficult and barely balanced balance was completely broken in an instant. The faces of Paul and King Tong changed dramatically at the same time. The situation of the whole battlefield was instantly reversed. Paul, King Tong, Lagos, and Hustiel. For Invincible Realm experts. Arsis, Melad, Situd Songyue, and Raphael. They were also 4 Invincible Realm experts. But in the case of Arsis fighting 1 against 2, Lagos and Hustiel's combat capability was almost equal to that of Raphael and Situd Songyue's. Melad, the weakest Invincible Realm expert on the surface, suddenly became the key to the key. The commandment of light and the forbidden spell of heaven were completely combined, and it was extremely perfect. Arisis's eyes were cold. The infinite light instantly soared, almost drowning everything. All the shadows disappeared in an instant. Arsis stamped his feet hard. Go to hell, all of you. The strong light tore through the sky. The void within a radius of a kilometer had been completely illuminated. In the night of Reki City under the heavy rain, it was as if a bright sun had suddenly risen. The light swept past. Paul's body was suddenly sent flying for nearly 100 meters, and a mouthful of blood spurted out of his mouth. King Tong was covered in blood, and her aura plummeted. Arsis took a step forward. In an instant, a silver edge suddenly lit up in the aftermath of the light. The silver edge was so small in the aftermath of the mighty light. But it was so sharp. The sword light was hidden. The combination of sword intent and sword energy was incomparably perfect. The focused and sharp light tore apart the mighty aftermath of the light in an instant. The sharp sword edge stabbed straight at King Tong. The sword light arrived in an instant. Sea-breaking style. Be careful. It's Li Tianlan. Paul suddenly roared crazily. But the silver light that suddenly appeared was like a meteor. Just as King Tong wanted to dodge, the long sword had already come to her face. Puff! With a slight sound, the blade directly pierced through King Tong's body. Blood spurted out. At the same time, an earth-shattering roar completely suppressed the chaos on the battlefield. Snowdance Corps. Charge. Outside the battlefield, in the darkness farther away, a figure, who had been hiding outside the perception range of the invincible realm experts, also stepped out of the darkness. Chapter 5:14. Blood flew out under the silver light, and the scarlet bloodlight looked extremely sad. This sword strike came suddenly. It was not earth-shattering, but it had an extremely condensed penetrating power. The remaining forbidden spell of heaven and the Shadow Kingdom were directly torn apart the moment the sword edge swept past. The silver light flashed away. As soon as Paul's roar sounded, the silver sword light had directly passed through King Tong's body, going through her front and back. Blood spurted and fell down. King Tong's figure was also falling. The silver flowing light bloomed and gathered, pushing King Tong's body to the ground. Wherever the silver sword light passed, the remaining domain was shattered. But the shattering was extremely small. As the sword light passed, the domain slowly closed again. This sword strike was like a light spot in the darkness. It was small, subtle, but bright, dazzling, and extremely perfect. King Tong's body fell hard to the ground. The messy battlefield suddenly shook, and countless cracks appeared on the ground centered on King Tong. Blood almost flowed out of control from the corners of King Tong's mouth. She moved her body, but she couldn't get up. The sword edge of falling stars pierced through her body, and the edge went through the middle of her chest and abdomen, straight and sharp. Although this sword was not aimed at a vital point, the edge of the sword had firmly nailed her to the ground. King Tong's body trembled slightly. At this moment, she was covered in blood and dust, looking extremely dirty and embarrassed. But her eyes were still arrogant and angry, and her demeanor did not seem to diminish at all. Li Tianlan's figure appeared beside her. He was dressed in a military uniform and stood tall and straight. "How could you?" King Tong's voice was hoarse and weak. Obviously, she did not expect that Li Tianlan's injury had basically recovered. Not only her, but no one had expected that Li Tianlan's current combat capability had reached such a terrifying level. The timing of the sword strike just now was perfect. The sword energy was sharp, and the sword intent was superior. Obviously, Li Tianlan, who had recovered quickly after being seriously injured, did not lose his foundation as rumored. Instead, he went further. In this state, Li Tianlan was no weaker than those experts on the holy list who were ranked at the bottom. And he was not really in the invincible realm yet. Li Tianlan took a step forward with a calm expression and said in a calm tone, "I kindly invited you to the office of the president as a guest, but you refused, so I had to come here in person." Boom! A loud boom suddenly erupted in the distant sky. In the blink of an eye, the night sky within a 1,000-meter radius was completely illuminated. Light and shadows collided. As soon as King Tong was attacked, Paul almost did not hesitate to burst out all his power. The completely different light shone in the night sky and turned into colorful colors. It was gorgeous and dangerous, like a miracle. In the colorful night sky, blood sprinkled down along with the night rain. Paul seemed to have gone completely crazy. Shadow carnage seemed to have made his speed countless times faster. His figure was less than 2 meters away from Arsis. The two of them had almost given up all defense and were fighting desperately. The void above the sky was chaotic and turbulent. Colorful rays of light kept bursting out. As the two of them passed through the night sky, a dazzling rainbow suddenly appeared in the chaotic night sky. This was almost the peak battle in the dark world. Even someone as strong as Mellad would find it difficult to participate without exposing his true strength. Li Tianlan squinted at the sky. It was not until this moment that he was completely sure of the true strength of the Patriarch of Rothschild. Arsis was obviously stronger than Paul, but there seemed to be something wrong with him now. His comprehensive strength had barely reached the peak of the invincible realm. Li Tianlan couldn't see the effect of the Pope's coronation at all. After Paul left the domain of King Tong, his strength did decline, but the decline was extremely limited. Although Arsis had an advantage over Paul in his normal state, his advantage was extremely small. To put it in an exaggerated way, it was negligible. Arsis's only advantage was that his physical strength was still abundant, while Paul's physical strength was greatly consumed. However, in the current state, Arceus couldn't do anything to Paul for a while. On the contrary, Paul's body movement was extremely strange, and the angle was tricky. When the two of them were almost the same in strength, Li Tianlan was surprised to find that Arceus had the possibility of failing miserably. He was not surprised that an expert at the peak of the invincible realm fought in close combat. The most helpless thing was that although Li Tianlan was very strong, it was obvious that he couldn't participate in a battle of this level at all. You will regret it, Li Tianlan. As long as I don't die sooner or later, you will regret everything you did tonight. King Tong's voice sounded in Li Tianlan's ears. It was hoarse and weak, and it sounded extremely resentful. Do you think I don't dare to kill you? Li Tianlan glanced at her. Why don't you try? King Tong sneered, and her voice was as cold as ice. If Li Tianlan wanted to kill her with that sword just now, he only needed to move a few centimeters closer, and she would definitely die. But Li Tianlan didn't do that. King Tong immediately figured out the key to the problem. Wang Tianzong did not appear on the battlefield tonight. But even the imprisoned Sword Emperor could still exert his will that could affect the general trend outside the battlefield. A very strange light flashed in King Tong's eyes. Her mouth seemed to move, and she closed her eyes. Boom! There was a sudden clap of thunder in the sky above the heavy rain. Pale lightning flashed across the sky. Above the sky, the two battlefields had gone completely crazy. Arceus and Paul were still entangled. Mellad, however, had already turned around and joined another equally critical battlefield. Situt Songyue and Raphael were already covered in blood. Opposite him, Hustil and Lagos were equally disheveled. But with the addition of Mellad, the whole scene was slowly turning around. The two battlefields above the sky were getting closer and closer. The dazzling light crisscrossed the sky and the ground. The situation, which had been tilting toward Rothschild, was pulled back bit by bit. Li Tianlan looked calm, but his eyes were getting more and more serious. Even though his combat capability had improved after the date of death, he was still the weakest in the battlefield of the invincible realm tonight. The battlefield of Paul and Arceus was merging with the battlefield of Situt Songyue. In such a situation, it was hard for him to know what he was doing. And for him, the biggest threat at the moment was no longer the several invincible realm experts on the other side, but, bang! An extremely dull explosion that seemed to be able to shake everyone's soul suddenly sounded without warning. Li Tianlan's heart sank in an instant. The battlefield on the ground, which was not as vast as the one in the sky but more tragic, suddenly rose with endless red light. This scene was so familiar that everyone felt like they had seen it before. Li Tianlan was even more familiar with it. This was the light of the devil troop. The red light spread wildly in the crowd with an incomparably distinct shockwave. The scarlet all over the sky swept everything in an instant. Wherever the light passed, the army of Wulan State, the elites of various forces, and even the Snowdance Corps were cleared in an instant. The whole street seemed to become empty in an instant. Li Tianlan's eyes instantly focused, and he rushed directly in the direction of the explosion. After Qin Weibai's explanation, he had already understood what the so-called devil troop was. A group of walking corpses who used to be in the invincible realm was not the most terrible thing. The most terrible thing was that their bodies were transformed by the materials of murderous weapons. They could control the murderous weapons in an instant. The materials of the murderous weapons in their bodies could naturally store energy like the murderous weapons. Perhaps the only difference was that the devil troop could not be used indefinitely. But they could also explode. This group of walking corpses without much consciousness, to be precise, were small murderous weapons that could move. Li Tianlan no longer cared about the battlefield in the sky, because the advantage had gradually expanded and become obvious. As the battle came to an end, dealing with the devil troop of the Wang family of Beihai was his most important task tonight. Boom! The moment Li Tianlan approached the devil troop, the two battlefields in the sky finally completely merged together. Chapter 5:15. The battlefield in the air had reached the most critical moment, but the fiercest fighting on the ground suddenly became silent. Only the red radiance continued to spread silently. The elites of the major forces kept roaring with their mouths open. Countless troops of Wulon state retreated in horror. But there was no sound. The sudden burst of light seemed to plunder everything, suppressing countless noises and turning them into silence. Wherever the red light passed, it melted and destroyed everything. Ordinary soldiers and elites of the ice-condensing realm disappeared quickly the moment they came into contact with the red light. Even many experts of the fire-flaming realm fell to the ground under the erosion of the light of the murderous weapon. They gradually decayed, and eventually turned into nothingness. The most complete nothingness. The red light slowly passed. All the people shrouded in the light had disappeared. The wind and rain were chaotic, and there was an empty space. Even the most basic ashes were not left. Everyone's heart was extremely cold. Tonight, Reki City was a huge meat grinder. Corpses were everywhere, and blood flowed like a river. The experts of the invincible realm died one by one. The people on the ground had long been ready to die in battle. But no one had seen such a strange death. They didn't know what was going on. The unknown was often scary. Under the great fear, the battlefield on the ground suddenly froze for a moment. In an instant, the red light in every corner of the battlefield burst out in a continuous stream. Endless raging fire and thunderbolts burst out in the crowd. If one only looked at the power, these flames and thunderbolts were not so amazing. At best, they were the power of the fire-flaming realm and the thunder-shocking realm, which was ordinary. But what was really frightening was the rhythm of the release of the flames and thunderbolts. This was a real outbreak. It broke out regardless of the consequences. The blazing fire rose into the sky. The thunderbolts were swirling in all directions. One after another, there was no pause. There was a red light in every corner of the battlefield. The red light was surrounded by flames and thunderbolts. Everyone could see that this was a person's attack. However, the raging flames and exploding thunderbolts were boundless and endless. Every time the opponent attacked, it seemed that he didn't need to gather strength at all. The violent rhythm pushed the terrifying heat to the peak in an instant. From a distance, it looked like the experts of the invincible realm kept bombarding with the power of the fire-flaming realm. This kind of power almost disregarded one's realm. Any martial artist had to accumulate power before making a move. Even if the charging time was very short, the process still existed. The other party seemed to be in the fire-flaming realm, but in an instant, an ordinary thunder-shocking realm expert in the fire-flaming realm could only make one move. However, the other party had already combined the power of several moves and smashed it. In an instant, the power of their one move was several times that of others in the same realm. The red light kept blossoming. The entire battlefield was torn apart by the explosion of fire and lightning. The invincible and even invincible Snowdance Corps was melting rapidly. However, the iron-blooded warriors did not retreat at all. Instead, they moved forward in silence. There were no more than 2,000 elites of the Snowdance Corps that Li Tianlan brought to the battlefield. The moment the red light burst out, almost one-third of them were gone. There was no power that could stop the devil army from converging. High up in the sky, the wind and clouds surged. The roar of several invincible realm experts shook the sky. The few red lights on the ground finally converged at one spot, completing the assembly. The sword light arrived. The silver light instantly drew a natural arc of light in the sky. The arc of light was no longer faint. The sharp sword energy cut through the sky and continued to stretch in the distant night. The silver light surged and burst out. Wherever the sword edge of falling stars passed, the whole night sky was like a mighty Milky Way, flying down. All the gathered devil army looked up at the silver light in the sky almost at the same time. The silver light was 100 meters long and roared down, shattering style. Someone in the devil army at the front took a step forward. The red light suddenly changed. The silver light rose. Almost in the blink of an eye, the silver light of the devil army and the sword light had gathered together. Falling stars trembled slightly in Li Tianlan's hand, with a clear sense of resistance. However, falling stars, which had not been fully charged, was not spiritual enough. The sword was finally swung down, but its power suddenly dropped a lot. With the mighty silver light, Li Tianlan landed in the crowd. The next second, a crazy and high-pitched dragon roar suddenly sounded in the night. Dragon Fist. Countless blue lightning bolts exploded with Li Tianlan as the center. The lightning bolts kept appearing, turning into blazing white, and finally turning into translucent light. One after another, dragon shadows roared wildly around Li Tianlan. Several eyes fell on Li Tianlan at the same time. They were extremely stiff, but in unison. Without any hesitation. The moment their eyes met, the surging power turned into a violent flow and broke out completely. The extremely strong fire and lightning pressed directly from all directions. The dragon-shaped lightning around Li Tianlan was torn apart and reorganized, and a pair of fists with absolute power directly punched out at the moment when countless lightning bolts surrounded him. In the dazzling light and shadow, there was only an expressionless face in front of him. Li Tianlan punched. He also punched. The dragon roar was extremely high-pitched. The fists of the two collided in an instant. Li Tianlan's body shook violently, and the joints all over his body made a sound. The dragon roar was completely deformed. The soldier of the devil army on the opposite side was directly sent flying nearly 20 meters by this punch, and smashed into a pile of ruins not far away. Smoke and dust rose all over the sky. The ruins shook for a moment, and the soldier of the devil army who had been blown away walked out again. One of his arms had fallen powerlessly, but his face was still expressionless. There was no retreat, no hesitation, no shock. His footsteps were getting faster and faster. In the entanglement of lightning and flames, several people of the devil army had completely formed a hole and rushed toward Li Tianlan fearlessly. The dragon-shaped lightning around Li Tianlan was startled and formed a pseudo-domain. But the pseudo-domain was completely torn under the first charge of several soldiers of the devil army. Countless flames and thunderbolts completely surrounded Li Tianlan, and the terrible power rushed into his body through every corner. Puff! Li Tianlan's face turned pale, and he suddenly spat out a mouthful of blood. But his eyes became sharper, and he didn't flinch at all. He punched. Dragon fist, dragon fighting in the wild. In the almost deafening dragon roar, the elites of all the major forces all rushed over. There were his own people of the Dark Knights, allies of the Vatican and the Heroes Club, and enemies of Rothschild and the Knights of Light. It was chaotic. The scene was completely chaotic. The enemies and his own people kept crossing each other in front of Li Tianlan. The devil army seemed to have completely locked him as a target, rushing all the way. Lightning and raging fire broke out almost non-stop. Countless attacks also fell on them at the same time. But every member of the devil army was expressionless. Their bones were broken, their flesh and blood were flying, and their bodies were bleeding. In the endless attacks, every member of the devil army was covered in blood. But no one took a step back. Every time the lightning and raging fire rolled, there would be a large number of casualties. Only 5 members of the devil army appeared, but they were like one, advancing and retreating together. Li Tianlan couldn't find any chance to kill one person alone. And when the 5 people attacked at the same time, even Li Tianlan, he could only avoid the attack for the time being. "Your Highness, let your troops follow me." A thin old man appeared beside Li Tianlan, and said with a ruthless expression. While he was speaking, a few figures with extremely powerful auras were also approaching him at the same time. "I'm guilty." The old man's tone was a little ferocious. "I can take people to separate them." "Your Highness, if you have a chance, kill one first." The devil army gave people a terrible feeling. Under such circumstances, with their combat effectiveness, they could even overturn the battlefield of tens of thousands of people in the end. Even if they only killed one, the pressure on them would be much less. And if they could kill one, they could naturally kill the second. Li Tianlan nodded. The next second, Li Tianlan's order sounded in the ears of the remaining 1,000 or so elites of the Snowdance Corps at the same time. The chaotic occupation suddenly changed. The Dark Knights took the lead. The torrent of the Snowdance Corps gathered directly toward the Devil Army. The remaining elites of the Men in Black and the fantasy world blocked the Knights of Light. The Vatican held up Rothschild. Sin replaced Li Tianlan as the leading figure. The Dark Knights and the Snowdance Corps gathered together. Charge! Under the constant eruption of countless thunderbolts and raging fire, the elites of the Dark Knights rushed in without hesitation. The The Snowdance Corps followed closely behind. It was mighty. The devil army began to charge at the same time. The raging fire and thunderbolts began to gather. The moment the two sides collided, blood suddenly flew all over the sky. The 5 members of the devil army were directly scattered for a moment under the desperate charge of the Dark Knights and the Snowdance Corps. A member of the devil army was drowned in the torrent of the crowd. Li Tianlan suddenly took a step forward. Dragon fist flying dragon in the sky. His figure rushed into the sky, and a punch fell directly. In the monstrous killing intent, countless dragon-shaped thunderbolts constantly gathered on Li Tianlan's fist. Li Tianlan's figure fell straight down. The member of the devil army, who was left alone, looked up at Li Tianlan. He seemed to know that he was no match for Li Tianlan. Without any hesitation, he directly chose the most decisive way. His eyes suddenly lit up with a red light. The red light rose into the sky. But the shadow fell from the sky. A gray shadow, which was so thick that it looked like a substance, pressed down from the sky in a mighty manner. The shadow was very high. It was even above the battlefield of the invincible realm. On the battlefield, Paul's figure instantly became more flexible. Everyone raised their heads at the same time. In their sight, King Tong, who should have been seriously injured and withdrawn from the battlefield, reappeared at the highest place of the battlefield. Her aura was stronger. In an all-out state, the dense and dark Shadow Kingdom directly fell down and pressed down on the battlefield of the invincible realm. Boom. In the earth-shattering noise, all the experts of the invincible realm were falling. The two battlefields in the sky and on the ground completely merged together in the blink of an eye. At the same time, countless red lights burst out and enveloped the entire battlefield. Chapter 5:16. The great change came suddenly. The battle situation was so chaotic that no one could predict it. Li Tianlan's brain froze for a moment. Everyone in the sky and on the ground was a little stunned. The devil troop on the ground was really tricky. This group of former invincible realm experts were willing to be transformed. With the foundation and technology of the Wang family of Beihai, they had really transformed them into real devils. The walking dead. They seemed to be alive but not dead. They seemed to be dead but not dead. Their bodies had been implanted with murderous weapon materials from the very beginning. That touch of spirituality seemed to have gradually replaced their souls. The perennial ice kept them in a relatively good fighting state. Such devils were destined not to live for a long time once they were born. But when they entered the fighting state, they were a truly invincible force. There was no pain, no thoughts, no vital points. There was no vital point. When the foundation of the invincible realm was combined with the murderous weapon, it completely became an unknown destructive power. And such a destructive power was called a devil. According to Qin Weibai's speculation, there would be no less than 24 members of the devil troop. Li Tianlan even suspected that if all the members of the devil troop attacked together, even Wang Tianzong would have to flee. Now Li Tianlan was facing only 5 people. He couldn't use his sword. Any attack was completely ineffective against them. They rushed up at the same time. Li Tianlan, the youngest expert with the combat capability of the invincible realm in the Dark World, didn't even have the ability to fight back. The elites of the Dark Knights saw this. Therefore, the Dark Knights and the Snowdance Corps divided the battlefield without hesitation. The 4 demons, whose eyes were glowing with red light, didn't even spare a glance at their separated comrades. The moment the crowd surrounded them, raging flames and lightning exploded. Blood splattered everywhere, and the cold massacre didn't stop at all. The lone devil's arm was just broken by Li Tianlan's punch. Although there was no pain, it was a fact that he couldn't lift his arm. He would not be Li Tianlan's opponent if he fought alone. So he didn't move. There was no thunder or raging fire. He looked up at Li Tianlan with red light in his eyes. In an instant, there was only red light left between heaven and earth. Li Tianlan could even clearly feel the scarlet heat in the other party's pupils. Falling stars was restless on his wrist. On the ground, the light in the devil's pupils turned fiery red, like a little bit of magma, constantly boiling. It was at this moment. The shadow suddenly fell. Li Tianlan felt the aura of King Tong. His mind went blank for a moment. He abruptly retracted the dragon fist that was charging forward with an indomitable will and quickly retreated. He did not kill King Tong. Although the sword didn't stab King Tong's vital parts, the sudden outburst of sword intent was enough to make King Tong completely lose all her fighting capacity. He didn't dare to touch Wang Tianzong's bottom line, so this was the result. But he didn't expect that King Tong could still move. The shadow was extremely dense, and the powerful aura was mighty. The domain that was close to the peak of the invincible realm perfectly merged with Paul's domain. For a moment, it actually suppressed the light of Situ Tsangyue, Raphael, and Arsis. There was no doubt that King Tong's injury had completely recovered. Even his physical strength had been completely restored. King Tong was now an expert who was close to the peak of the invincible realm. Only the highest engine potion could make an invincible realm expert recover his combat capability quickly. There were only a few kinds of potions that could achieve this effect in the entire dark world, and they could be counted on one hand. Rothschild didn't have such technology. Neither did the Shadow Throne. But the Wang family of Beihai did. Wang Tianzong gave the potion, which meant an extra life for an invincible realm expert, to King Tong. Li Tianlan was a little confused. If he could get hold of the evidence of this kind of transaction, he could even directly confirm the fact that Wang Tianzong had committed treason. He was tempted for a moment, and then he thought that King Tong had this kind of potion. Did Paul have it? His heart turned cold again for a moment. In a trance and confusion, King Tong, who had tried her best to condense her domain, screamed and fell. The shadow completely covered her in the blink of an eye. On the ground, the red light in the eyes of the devil who was alone suddenly burst out completely. It was like flowing magma. The night between heaven and earth suddenly burst into a fiery red. This was the purest light, without any substance, but with a kind of power to destroy everything. The eyes of the devil who was alone burst open. His body also burst open. Boundless flames flew out unscrupulously. Li Tianlan's heart suddenly felt a little cold. He subconsciously thought of the short moment when he fought with the devil troop. From the moment the devil troop was divided to the present. From the beginning to the end, the devil troop was silent and did not rescue him. And the devil who was alone also did not ask for help. The moment he was sure that he was no match for Li Tianlan, he directly detonated his eyes without the slightest hesitation. Indifferent, ruthless, straightforward, and decisive. This was a real war machine. There was no sacrifice, no life and death. The red light and the shadow kept alternating. The anxious battle was instantly interrupted by the terrifying explosion. Even Arsis and Paul flew back at the first time. The huge shock wave swept everything, and the fiery red light kept hovering in the sky. Within the range of the red light, everyone below the thunder-shocking realm was completely melted the moment they touched the light, silently. The scene was silent and horrifying. Li Tianlan was in a trance. Everyone was in a trance. This was the devil troop. And their eyes were undoubtedly the place where the materials of the murderous weapons were stored. Therefore, although the opponent's dying blow was different from the full blow of the murderous weapons, its nature was the same. This was the real devil's eye. The violent explosion, with a loud sound that shook the sky, kept sweeping everything around it. The Snowdance Corps and the Dark Knights were forced to disperse. The extreme chaos did not stop at all. The red light flickered slightly in Li Tianlan's sight. In the fighting crowd, several different domains were formed in an instant. The domain of King Tong was still solid and condensed. The light of the forbidden spell of heaven swept in all directions, but there was always a shadow around Paul. The two of them had become two shadows that even Li Tianlan could hardly distinguish. The extremely dangerous collision sounds were extremely dense. The power of the two of them fighting tore the space apart. As they moved, the elites of the surrounding forces and the army of the Snowdance Corps were all shocked into blood mist by the violent power. Melad did not help this time. It seemed that ever since the red light of the devil troop had appeared, he had become timid. He kept a distance from a few devils and hesitated to move forward. His attitude had changed very subtly. However, on the entire battlefield, Melad was timid. His role had suddenly been reduced by countless times. Two devils of the devil troop had already appeared beside Situ Tsangyue. The majestic domain kept hovering around Situt Songyue. Between the two evil demons' attacks, there was a continuous stream of fire and lightning. The huge destructive power quickly nibbled away at Situt Songyue's useless heaven and earth. The sword energy in the domain was flying fast. The two devils were already covered in blood, and even their bones could be seen. But their speed was getting faster and faster. Raphael was very close to Situt Songyue, but it was too late for him to rescue her. Lagos and Hustiel's attacks were completely crazy. It was obvious that they wanted to kill Raphael first to break the situation. The Dark Saint spear once again turned into a shield. The huge shield completely surrounded Raphael's body. Lagos and Hustiel, the two invincible experts on the divine list, attacked together, but Raphael focused on defense. Unexpectedly, they could not break through Raphael's defense. The remaining two demons rushed directly in front of Li Tianlan. Without any nonsense, the crazy and uninterrupted attacks suddenly whistled to him. With the addition of the devil troop, a new balance was formed in the situation that was constantly being pulled apart. Li Tianlan's eyes were gradually filled with scarlet streaks of blood. The new balance was so fragile, and fragility often meant being out of control. Li Tianlan suddenly became extremely angry. Absolute anger completely overwhelmed all his reason in an instant. Here. It was Reki City. It was the place occupied by the Snowdance Corps. He had an absolute advantage in strength, but now everything had become like this. He was even ready to face failure. Rothschild was the enemy he had to deal with. He might kill him, but he did not dare to kill him. Their huge advantage had gradually been obliterated. Mitchell died. Huang Kong died. Cass Rotter died. Tribulation withdrew from the battlefield with serious injuries. Qin Shilai withdrew from the battlefield with serious injuries. But now he still had to face the endless power of his opponents. The drugs of the Wang family of Beihai. The devil troop of the Wang family of Beihai. The bottom line of the Wang family of Beihai. F***CKU. Why? This was Reki City that the Snowdance Corps had conquered. Wasn't it Reki City in Zhongzhou State? The only difference was that this would not be Reki City of the Wang family of Beihai. Was this the reason why you stopped me? Why? In the thunder and fire, Li Tianlan turned his head and glanced in the direction of the office of the president. The light and shadow were dazzling. It was raining cats and dogs. The street lights were dim. The office of the president was faintly visible. But he could clearly sense that the will of Sword Emperor Wang Tianzong was watching this place with an unparalleled sense of oppression. Li Tianlan's eyes suddenly turned red. You can't stop me. He thought silently. No one can stop me. Puff. A mouthful of blood sprayed out of Li Tianlan's mouth with extreme anger. His face instantly became extremely ferocious. Get lost. An extremely loud dragon roar suddenly resounded throughout the battlefield. Li Tianlan strode forward. The densely packed dragon shadows turned into bolts of lightning. His figure broke through the thunder and rushed into the fire. He waved his fist. Dragon fist and azure dragon arrow. In an instant, there was a piercing sound in the air. Li Tianlan's figure was completely straightened. His punch seemed to drive his whole body, and flew directly to the nearest member of the Devil Corps. Bang! The fist with great power collided with the opponent's arm. At the same time, another devil's fist directly hit Li Tianlan's back. Li Tianlan's face suddenly turned pale, but he ignored it. Dragon fist and azure dragon hammer. The sky tens of meters above the horizon suddenly changed shape. The dragon silhouettes that were whistling around him converged into one, turning into an incomparably ferocious giant hammer. Li Tianlan's arm fell. The shadow of the giant hammer also fell. Boom. The whole street shook under the huge impact. As strong as the devil was, he also lost control of his body in this turbulent power, and flew up directly. Before his body landed on the ground, Li Tianlan had already grabbed his ankle. The thunder and fire had completely surrounded Li Tianlan. The devil whose ankle was grabbed by Li Tianlan suddenly rotated, and the other foot directly swept over with enough power to break the space. The attack of another devil fell wildly on Li Tianlan's back. Li Tianlan threw the devil in his hand out. The crazy sword intent completely enveloped his figure. Blood spurted from the devil's body. His body was torn apart, but no bones could be seen. In Li Tianlan's sight, what was exposed under the devil's skin and flesh were pieces of alloy shining with mysterious luster. Li Tianlan ignored it. The devil's body crashed into a collapsed ruin. The next second, a large piece of ruins suddenly flew up. Li Tianlan's figure directly rushed over. Huge stones, broken glass, and broken steel bars were suddenly completely lifted into the sky. Li Tianlan's fists were all condensed with white thunder to the extreme. The devil troop was very strong. But Li Tianlan was fast enough. In an instant he completely gave up all defense. His fists shining with thunder were like a storm, constantly smashing on the devil's body. Bang! The mysterious alloy in the devil's body was completely broken under the continuous bombardment of great power. And the devil's legs were broken under Li Tianlan's crazy attack. Eternal destruction sunset. An extremely dry and mechanical voice suddenly sounded behind Li Tianlan. In an instant, the eyes of the devil with only half a body in front of Li Tianlan suddenly burst out a scarlet light, as if it had heard some mysterious command. Boom! The remaining half of the devil's body suddenly burned. But it was burning with red fire. The red flame kept burning in his half-body. In the blink of an eye, the devil became a man of fire. The devil who had been chasing Li Tianlan and attacking him suddenly retreated. Only a voice sounded in Li Tianlan's ear. He just ate an eye. Li Tianlan didn't realize what had happened. His wrist suddenly tightened. Falling stars was constantly twisting in his hand. The red flame on the devil's body burned on falling stars without warning. Li Tianlan's face changed. His sword intent surged and completely wrapped falling stars. At the same time, the burning devil rushed directly to Li Tianlan and held his body with both hands. He rushed forward. His strength increased several times in an instant. He held Li Tianlan and rushed directly to the invincible realm battlefield. Boom! A little farther away, endless red light suddenly burst out. That was Situt Sungyue's battlefield. In the next second, the red light in front of Li Tianlan continued to expand. Bang! An incomparably scarlet explosion, which was no less powerful than a real murderous weapon, suddenly sounded in front of Li Tianlan. Li Tianlan blacked out. He didn't lose consciousness. Instead, a huge shield that was big enough to completely wrap his body suddenly appeared around him. The shield quickly shrank around him and finally turned into an armor. Raphael, who had lost the Dark Saint spear, was instantly covered by the attacks of Lagos and Hastile. Blood spurted out of his body crazily. At the same time, on the edge of the battlefield, a figure who had wanted to appear on the battlefield, but retreated finally took a step forward this time. Last time, he took a step forward with his left foot. But this time it was his right foot. Different directions, different choices. An extremely ferocious big spear appeared in his hand. He raised the spear. In an instant, the night sky was dim. One of the 12 murderous weapons in the dark world. The Twilight of the Gods. The Twilight of the Gods of the Heroes Club. Charlemagne, the president of the Heroes Club, finally came to the battlefield at the last moment of the war. But this spear was not aimed at Paul. It was Arcis. Boom! The dim yellow light in the sky gathered into a ray of light. The next second, it directly penetrated Arcis's body. Arcis's body suddenly shook and he lowered his head in disbelief. The next second, Paul had already rushed over and kicked Arcis away. The scene became completely silent in an instant. Situt Sungyue fell down. Raphael fell down. Arcis was hit head-on by the murderous weapon and fell down. On the entire battlefield, there were only 2 people left on Li Tianlan's side. He still had Melad. Paul's eyes turned and fell on Melad. Melad touched his nose and suddenly laughed. "I think I can surrender." The corner of Li Tianlan's mouth twitched. He was silent for a long time. Now he was really the only one left. He glanced at Charlemagne, the president of the Heroes Club, who suddenly attacked Arcis, and didn't say anything. Paul narrowed his eyes and looked at Li Tianlan. Suddenly he smiled playfully. "Now we can have a good time." Chapter 517. No one could have imagined that the situation would suddenly become like this. Li Tianlan couldn't have imagined it. Arcis couldn't have imagined it. Paul couldn't have imagined it either. Everyone thought that the war would last for a long time. But in an instant, the red light burst out, and the dim yellow light lit up. The whole night sky suddenly became quiet. This war, which was bound to shock the whole dark world, suddenly came to an end. The general trend had been decided. The outcome had been decided. President Charlemagne of the Heroes Club. He ranked 6th on the World Divine List. He held the murderous weapon Twilight of the Gods. His participation instantly reversed all the situations. Even the battles between the elites of the major forces had stopped. The elites of the Heroes Club looked at their president, a little confused, a little embarrassed, and more at a loss. The dim yellow light in the sky gradually dimmed and melted in the seemingly endless rain. Dusk passed. The night was still night. Charlemagne stood not far from Paul. The eyes of this president, who was also very close to the peak of the invincible realm, were calm and cold. Li Tianlan suddenly nodded, as if he understood something, or as if he understood. The Heroes Club was supposed to be his ally tonight. Everyone knew this. The new invincible realm expert of the Heroes Club also expressed his position with his death. But not all allies were as reliable as the Dark Knights. Raphael would rather be seriously injured, or even die to put the Dark Saint's spear on Li Tianlan to protect him from harm, because he was one of them. But the Heroes Club was just an ally. They cooperated for the sake of interests. Now Situt Songyue was seriously injured, Raphael was seriously injured, Tribulation was seriously injured, and Qin Shilai was seriously injured. The people around him were either dead or injured, while King Tong, Lagos, and Hustiel were standing next to Paul, as well as the devil army with unimaginable destructive power. Li Tianlan would lose. Whether this was true or not, at least this was Charlemagne's judgment. So when the battle was in a stalemate, when the devil troop knocked Li Tianlan into the battlefield, and was about to self-destruct, Charlemagne directly took action. He took action against Arsis. The murderous weapon Twilight of the Gods roared over Eastern Europe. The explosion of the devil troop and the murderous weapon sounded at the same time. The huge power was superimposed for a moment. The aftermath of the explosion of the devil and the energy of the Twilight of the Gods all hit Arsis. Even an expert at the peak of the invincible realm could not resist the murderous weapon without preparation. As a result, Arsis was also heavily injured. The aftermath of the huge power swept across the battlefield, and even disabled Raphael and Situt Songyue. Only Li Tianlan was not seriously injured under the protection of the Dark Saint Spear. Charlemagne made the calmest and most rational choice. For the sake of the benefits at hand, he gave up the hatred and resentment of Mitchell's murder, and stood by the winner. It was hard to understand. But it was also extremely normal. No one despised what Charlemagne had done. His actions couldn't even be considered as betrayal. This was the dark world. The relationship between friend and foe had always been extremely vague. What do you want? Paul looked at Charlemagne and suddenly asked. His entire body was completely relaxed. The battle with Arsis had injured him. The injury was not light, but it was not serious either. At least it did not affect his combat power. Right now he was still the strongest person present. This kind of strength could allow him to solve everything. That included getting rid of Mellad and Li Tianlan, and completely establishing the general trend of Wulan's state. Li Tianlan was alone. The huge advantage he had before had completely disappeared. There was no chance for him to make a comeback. He was a loser. And there were 3 invincible realm experts assisting him. He could also turn Charlemagne into a loser. Paul narrowed his eyes and looked at Charlemagne thoughtfully. Charlemagne opened his hand slightly. A fist-sized stone was left where the devil had exploded. The stone flew into his hand, emitting a faint red light. Paul's face changed and he remained silent. Europe is yours. Charlemagne looked down at the stone in his hand and said flatly, America belongs to the Heroes Club. Everyone was staring at the stone in Charlemagne's hand. Everyone knew what it was. This was a murderous weapon belonging to Star State. The holy punishment of Void. The devil detonated the holy punishment of Void and killed Cass Rotter. The remaining materials of the murderous weapon were absorbed into the devil's body, and finally exploded in the field. The holy punishment of Void was extremely damaged. It could be predicted that it would be difficult for this murderous weapon to recover its peak power in the long years. But this stone was the core of the holy punishment of void. If possible, who wouldn't want to take it for themselves? What do you think? Charlemagne glanced at Paul. Intentionally or unintentionally, he waved the murderous weapon in his hand. The body of the twilight of the gods was slender and ferocious. The muzzle was rough, and the whole body was dark yellow, with a kind of breathtaking magic. Paul looked at the twilight of the gods and was silent for a long time. The 12 murderous weapons in the dark world might become the 11 murderous weapons tonight. Among the 11 murderous weapons, the twilight of the gods had a domineering name, but its power was the worst. But it was also the most valued murderous weapon. Because the twilight of the gods sacrificed its overall power. It had a feature that other murderous weapons didn't have. It could shoot continuously. The human emperor, who could destroy the world with one shot. The indefinite grace with the strongest single penetrating power. The blue sky underworld with violent power. The sunset with the fastest energy accumulation. The murderous weapon often had the power to change the overall situation with one shot. So almost all murderous weapons only needed one shot. But the twilight of the gods had a completely different idea. The twilight of the gods could store energy once, but it could shoot continuously. No one knew how many shots the twilight of the gods could shoot continuously, which was also a big suspense in the dark world. Since the establishment of the Heroes Club, the twilight of the gods had fired 3 times in one day and killed 3 invincible realm experts. Its power was indeed the weakest among the murderous weapons, but it had the highest error tolerance. No matter how weak a murderous weapon was, it was still a murderous weapon. Ordinary invincible realm experts naturally couldn't withstand it. Today, it was the first time the twilight of the gods had fired in recent years. Only one shot. With the explosion of the devil troop and Paul's attack, Arsis was seriously injured. And the next second, as long as Charlemagne wanted, the muzzle of the twilight of the gods could be aimed at Paul and fired again. Paul nodded and said calmly, "That's good. Happy cooperation." Charlemagne put away the core of the holy punishment of void with no expression on his face. No one said anything. Since there was cooperation, Rothschild had to give compensation. The Heroes Club lost an invincible realm expert. Now Charlemagne took the core of the holy punishment of void, and the loss was even. This core was destined not to become the holy punishment of void again. It was likely to be used to strengthen the twilight of the gods. Whether it was strengthening the number of shots of the twilight of the gods or strengthening its power, it was not a good thing for the dark world. It also meant the birth of another peerless murderous weapon, that could even rival the human emperor, and the indefinite grace. Paul took a deep look at Charlemagne. After tonight, the pattern of the dark world would change greatly. The men in black and the dragons in the fantasy world would be leaderless. The murderous weapon of Star State would have a new owner. The Jiang family of South America would also lose Jiang Qianyan, and Jiang Qiansong would be expelled from the Jiang family of South America. All of America, whether it was South America or North America, would be the world of the Heroes Club. Just like today's Europe, whether it was Eastern Europe or Western Europe, after tonight, it would be the world of Rothschild and the Eastern Church. Paul suddenly reached out and patted Charlemagne on the shoulder. He said calmly, "As long as you kill Arsis, the cooperation will take effect immediately." Arsis had fallen far away, unconscious and silent. Charlemagne raised his eyebrows sharply. Boom! The surrounding space was instantly distorted. Under the night sky, a magnificent sword light suddenly flashed. The sword light was extremely dazzling. It divided heaven and earth, but it also pulled heaven and earth. In an instant, it seemed that the whole starry sky had fallen under this sword. Under the sword light, the sword energy was surging and vast like an ocean. Endless sword energy surged toward Paul. Several invincible realm experts subconsciously took a few steps back. The surging sword light was like a sea. The battlefield was misty. The sword light went from one end to the other at a rapid speed, and disappeared in an instant. Several invincible realm experts looked at each other in surprise, and did not speak. Paul looked ahead, and his face was a little livid. In his sight, Arsis, who was unconscious on the ground, had disappeared. At the same time, Melad disappeared. It doesn't matter. After a long time, Paul said slowly, "In a short time, Arsis won't recover from his injury. No one can stop us." Just now, King Tong hesitated. Was it Melad? Paul nodded. On the battlefield of the invincible realm, he had already noticed that Melad had hidden his strength. His real strength was even stronger than King Tong's current strength. He should be on par with Charlemagne. Charlemagne, on the other hand, ranked 6th on the divine list. Such strength was really very close to the peak of the invincible realm. But Paul did not expect that the second commander of the Holy Disarmament Corps of the Vatican used a sword. The majestic and magnificent sword light blew away the silence. The whole battlefield suddenly broke out again. The elites of the Vatican were still there because of the escape of the second commander. Charlemagne had already raised his palm. The hero would obey all orders. In an instant, the Dark Knights, who had just been fighting side by side with the Vatican, directly aimed their blades at the Vatican. The Saint warriors fell down in large numbers. In the great chaos, the army of Wulon State slowly pressed over. Situd Songyue and Raphael were carried back to the office of the president in the chaos. Paul saw this scene, but he did not stop it. He could judge the state of Raphael and Situd Songyue. Situd Songyue was in a slightly better state, but her strength was weak. Raphael was seriously injured, but he was strong. Neither of them was in a good state. At least, it was impossible for them to recover without a few years of rest. After tonight, Eastern Europe would be his. Of course, he would not give the two of them time to recuperate. What could they do even if they retreated to the office of the president? Paul took a step forward and looked at Li Tianlan. Li Tianlan stood in his original position. The Dark Saint's spear turned into an extremely close-fitting armor and stuck to his body. His face was indifferent, without sadness or joy. "You didn't run away." Paul laughed. Tonight, the Shadow Throne was disbanded, and he was forced to take action. Rothschild could be said to have suffered a heavy loss. But now he was the winner after all. All the losses would be made up with this victory. So he had no reason not to be in a good mood. "Where to?" Li Tianlan asked. His tone was quiet and dead silent. Paul was stunned for a moment, and then understood what he meant. Where could Li Tianlan go now? The sword light just now was a chance for him to escape, but what would happen after that? Should he go back to the office of the president and gather the Snowdance Corps to fight them to the death? There were still nearly 10,000 elites in the Snowdance Corps. They were the most elite corps in the world. But Paul, King Tong, Lagos, Hustile, and Charlemagne. An expert who was infinitely close to the peak of the invincible realm. 2 experts who were close to the peak of the invincible realm. 2 on the divine list. There were also the elites of the Heroes Club, Rothschild, the Eastern Church, the Morton family, and the Violet family. The Snowdance Corps couldn't resist this force. Where could he go if he left the Snowdance Corps? Escape back to Zhongzhou State? He was the Marshal of Zhongzhou State. On the first day he came to Zhongzhou State, he set off the date of death, and then planned the trial day tonight. Now the Snowdance Corps had suffered heavy losses. Zhongzhou State had suffered heavy losses. He also imprisoned the Sword Emperor. In the end he ended up with a crushing defeat. What would be the consequences of returning to Zhongzhou State? He couldn't bear the crime of imprisoning the Sword Emperor. He also couldn't bear the crime of almost wiping out the Snowdance Corps. Rothschild would not let him go in Eastern Europe. In Zhongzhou State, Kunlun City, the Wang family of Beihai, and the Prince Group would not let him go either. Li Tianlan had no way out. He wanted to stand here. He could only stand here. He could only stand here. Even if he died in battle. If he died in battle here, he would still be guilty and would be nailed to death on the pillar of shame. But at least it was not treason. After his death, the Li family could still barely survive. Maybe they would return from Lin, and to the primeval forest where they couldn't drink clean water or eat meat. They would also go to a worse place. But the Li family was still there. Paul looked at Li Tianlan quietly. Li Tianlan's expression was calm. There was no tragedy, no unwillingness, no madness. Only calmness. Whether it was helplessness, grief, or resentment. In this situation, everything was meaningless. The few remaining members of the devil troop in the field were eyeing him covetously. Li Tianlan looked up at the night sky. The night sky in Eastern Europe was cold and lonely, high and distant. After all, he still didn't bear the future and hope of the Li family. He was the chosen one with amazing talent, but he could do nothing now. The falling stars turned into a long sword on his wrist. Li Tianlan held the sword with both hands, looked at Paul, and said calmly, "Come on." The only thing he could do now was to draw the sword. "Do you have any last words?" Paul looked at him with some emotion in his eyes. At this moment, Li Tianlan was like a microcosm of an era in his eyes. Hundreds of years ago, the Li family was like the rising sun, shining brightly. The original invincible realm expert of the Li family joined forces with the Wang family of Beihai to suppress the Vatican and help Rothschild get through the difficulties. 20 years ago, the Li family was like the sun in the sky. Its light was so bright that people couldn't look at it directly. In the last 2 decades, it was the Li family's twilight. The light was still there, but it was gradually dimming. The only hope had been stumbling forward in the general trend, but the road ahead was not clear. And now, the hope of the Li family was about to die. This family, which had been glorious in Zhongzhou state for hundreds of years, was about to enter the everlasting night. The funniest thing was that it was Rothschild, who helped the Li family when it first rose, that completely plunged the Li family into darkness. Paul was in a trance, but there was no guilt in his eyes. Li Tianlan didn't speak, but the blade of the falling stars suddenly gave off a dazzling sword light. It was not his swordsmanship. It was the 24 moves of sword. The purest 24 moves of sword. It was as if he was bearing something, but also as if he was venting something. After many years, the light of the 24 moves of sword once again lit up under the sky of Eastern Europe and rushed to the sky. The first blade Wuji. The condensed and sharp sword light lit up on the blade. The blade of the falling star stabbed straight at Paul. It was shining, dazzling, persistent and crazy. Paul raised his palm. He was an expert who was infinitely close to the peak of the invincible realm. In the face of Li Tianlan, he didn't even need to use weapons. A shadow bloomed in his hand. The bright sword blade instantly pierced into the shadow. Bang! Paul raised his palm. Li Tianlan was directly sent flying by him with one hand, and hit a wall dozens of meters away. The wall collapsed with a crash. Smoke and dust were flying. The sword light lit up. The fifth blade flying snow. A large amount of sword intent brought out icicles and kept whistling. King Tong appeared in front of Li Tianlan. You should have seen this day coming. Her eyes were cruel and happy. The chosen one? In my eyes you are a clown. You have always been. Ridiculous and stupid. Bang. The Shadow Kingdom stretched out around King Tong. The incomparably condensed domain wiped out the sword intent and pulled Li Tianlan's body in front of King Tong. King Tong stretched out her long legs and kicked Li Tianlan's face directly. Li Tianlan's body was smashed back like a cannonball. Blood fell to the ground with the rain. Li Tianlan's body moved in the mess. The raging fire was flying in the rain. The eighth blade, burning sky. Heresy should be judged by God. The light of heaven in Hustiel's hand was extremely bright. The surging light completely penetrated Li Tianlan's body in an instant. The raging fire went out. Blood burst out of Li Tianlan's body. The falling stars flew out of his hand and into the distance, turning into a stream of silver light. A mess of stones and dust had almost completely drowned Li Tianlan. He had the combat capability of the invincible realm in the dark world. But the gap between him and the real invincible realm on the divine list was completely revealed at this moment. Blood was flowing all over his body, and he staggered to his feet. I will die. His voice was quiet and terrifying, but there were countless emotions hidden in his eyes. But Violet, Morton, and the other 3 patriarchs of the Eastern Church will all die with me tonight. Boom. The huge shadow of the fist came down from the sky. Li Tianlan's figure was directly smashed to the ground by the punch without any room to resist. Lagos's stiff and furious voice sounded. Say that again. Li Tianlan suddenly laughed. The next moment, the figure of Lagos, the patriarch of the Morton family, appeared directly in front of Li Tianlan. The fist with infinite power fell on Li Tianlan like a storm. Say it. Say it again. Bang bang bang. Blood kept splashing. Paul and King Tong stood together. Charlemagne stood aside. Hastile frowned. Everyone was looking at Li Tianlan, whose blood was splashing, with indifferent eyes. Bang! Lagos's punch directly sent Li Tianlan's body flying, and his figure appeared directly above Li Tianlan. He stepped directly on him. The extremely terrifying foot stepped directly on Li Tianlan's face. Li Tianlan's head was stepped into the ground. Say it. Aren't you very talkative? Lagos's laughter was crazy and twisted. Li Tianlan's body was still moving. He couldn't get up, but he could still crawl forward with his hands. He stretched out his hands. The next moment, they fell on a pair of feet. The feet stood firmly on the ground, motionless. Li Tianlan's body suddenly trembled. Apex. Chapter 5:18. It was night in Linen. The lake was rippling, and the night wind was cool. Under a luxuriant willow by the lake, Li Honghe put a piece of spiced beef into his mouth, drank up the wine in the glass and said, "It tastes good. Don't you want to try it?" The wine was huadiao, brewed by Yu Donglai himself. It was mellow and delicious. Even though the night wind was getting stronger, the fragrance of the wine was still wafting. Dongqing Hongguang stared at Li Honghe motionlessly. He didn't touch the food or drink, nor did he speak. "You said you believed me." Li Honghe looked more serious. He looked at Dongqing Hongguang with deep eyes. "I believe you." Dongqing Hongguang nodded. "But I didn't come here from Zhongyuan to listen to this." "Then what do you want to hear?" Li Honghe asked. His tone was calm, tasteless, and even desireless. "Something else," Dongqing Hongguang said indifferently. The old man who used to be in charge of the army headquarters of Zhongzhou State was introverted at this moment, but his eyes flashed with an extremely sharp and heavy edge. "Something else?" Li Honghe asked. "Something else." Dongqing Hongguang repeated it again. Li Honghe fell silent. The night wind blew the willow, and the treetops rustled. The leaves fell on the surface of the West Lake, causing ripples and spreading softly. The wind was getting colder. It was about to rain in Linen. Li Honghe was silent for a long time before he slowly said, "I can't say." He and Dongqing Hongguang were old friends. They had known each other for decades, and were very close friends. But now the old friend wanted to hear something else. But he couldn't say it. The phone suddenly rang. Dongqing Hongguang took the phone. Someone on the phone reported something in a hurried tone. Dongqing Hongguang's face remained unchanged, but he suddenly clenched his fists in his sleeves for a moment. A deep blue thunderbolt was reflected in Li Honghe's pupils. There was a muffled thunder in the air, rolling across the sky. Dongqing Hongguang put down the phone in his hand and slowly sat in front of Li Honghe. Li Honghe wanted to take the wine in front of him, but under such a gaze, he withdrew his hand calmly. The two looked at each other for a long time. Dongqing Hongguang raised the phone in his hand and said expressionlessly, "I just got the news." Hidden God Situt Songyue withdrew from the battlefield with heavy injuries. The leader of the Dark Knights, Raphael, was seriously injured and left the battlefield. Melad of the Vatican ran away with Arcis. Bang. He slammed the phone on the table and leaned over to look at Li Honghe. Now in Reki City, there is only Tianlan himself. Li Honghe was silent for a while and shook his head. "I'm fine." Crash. Dongqing Hongguang suddenly stood up and overturned the table full of wine and dishes in front of him. The meat and cold dishes were thrown up. The wine jars were overturned in the air, and the table was broken. All of them fell into the West Lake, fluttering. "He's fine." Dongqing Hongguang's thunder-like roar suddenly sounded. "What will happen? Ha! Do you have to wait until all the invincible realm experts stand in front of Li Tianlan before you say anything? Am I right? Tianlan is not only your grandson, but also my grandson. Now that child has to face Paul, King Tong, the Heroes Club, the Eastern Church, and the Morton family. He was only 22 years old. He's only 22. Li Honghe quietly looked at Dongqing Hongguang, who was a little hysterical. Not far away, the guards of the Dongqing clan and the elites of the Li family ran over at the same time. Li Honghe waved his hand. Everyone retreated again. There was a light rain falling from the sky. The wind gradually died down. The rain was getting heavier. In the gradually rapid sound of the rain, Li Honghe looked at Dongcheng Hanguang and said slowly, "This is the weight he should bear." Yes. Dongcheng Hanguang took a deep breath. He has something to bear. But we old guys are still alive. You're still alive. He's working hard in Eastern Europe now. What are you doing? Drinking a little wine and happily saying that it's all right? What's your plan? Tell me. His voice became a little pleading. Even his eyes were pleading. Even a little. Li Honghe looked at him. From Dongcheng Hanguang's eyes, he saw worry, anxiety, and more fear. It was an extremely real fear. This old man came to Lin from Zhongyuan, and all he wanted was a little psychological comfort. But Li Honghe couldn't give him that. He shook his head. I can't say. Dongcheng Hanguang looked at him, and the light in his eyes gradually disappeared. I regret it, he said suddenly. Li Honghe was stunned, then shook his head. He still said the same two words, monotonous and calm. It's all right. I know Situt Songyue is your person. Dongcheng Hanguang paused and said with a self-deprecating smile. I'm afraid that even Li Kuangta didn't know that he knew Situt Songyue. It was all your arrangement. It was also you who arranged for her to go to Mount Taibai, through Great Master Wu Wei. She could enter the invincible realm, because of your guidance. Dongcheng Hanguang looked at Li Honghe. She is a chess piece in your hand, but this chess piece has now withdrawn from the battlefield. What other chess pieces do you have? No matter how many chess pieces there are, it's useless. Li Honghe said calmly. What's the point of having more chess pieces on the chessboard? It may be meaningful, but it's not the most important thing. Then what's the most important thing? Dongcheng Hanguang looked into Li Honghe's eyes and asked. The most important thing, of course, is the hand that plays chess. Without this hand, the chess pieces can't move on the chessboard, or they will only walk around randomly and get worse and worse. With that hand here, even if the chess pieces are gone, the palm can directly overturn the whole chessboard, Li Honghe said. Well said. Dongcheng Hanguang was silent for a while, then nodded and said, It's easy for you to say. In Reki City, Paul was infinitely close to the peak of the invincible realm. Charlemagne's strength was not as good as Paul's, but it was higher than King Tong's. His strength was similar to Paul's. Moreover, the twilight of the gods could be launched continuously. With the murderous weapon in hand, his combat capability might not be lower than Paul's. These were two experts who were infinitely close to the peak of the invincible realm. There was also King Tong, who was close to the peak of the invincible realm. There were also two people on the divine list, and people suspected to be from the devil troop. Could such a chessboard be overturned with one hand? What kind of hand would that be? Now you're saying that Wang Tianzong has always been your person, and I'm willing to believe it. Dongcheng Hanguang said seriously. What he said was absurd, but his tone was very solemn. Of course not. Li Honghe shook his head and said, Reki City tonight, after all, is the Li family's own business. A bolt of thunder flashed across the sky. Under the wind and rain, the old man looked into the distance and repeated calmly, It's okay. The vehicle was running in the messy streets of Reki City. In the huge carriage, Lin Fengting looked at the picture on the screen in silence. There was no fluke. No matter how heaven-defying Li Tianlan was, it was impossible for him to turn defeat into victory under the attack of several invincible realm experts. The wind and rain were messy. Li Tianlan's body was like a ball, being hit from one side to the other by several invincible realm experts. Cruel, ruthless, vicious, and insidious. This was the most blatant torture and killing. This was the cruelest way to vent. But Li Tianlan was still attacking. Time and time again. His body flew out, and the long sword fell out of his hand. But he struggled to stand up again and again. Without a sword he punched. His attack was terrible, but it was futile. There were still 5 invincible realm experts in front of Li Tianlan. But even the weakest Lagos was an expert on the divine list, far better than Li Tianlan. His counterattack was directly suppressed by several invincible realm experts. The great power destroyed his body, even the foundation and vitality in his body. Li Tianlan stood up, fell down, and then stood up again. He had no way back. Even if he died here, he could not retreat. Lin Fengting watched silently, and did not speak for a long time. Bang! There was the sound of a heavy object falling to the ground behind him. Lin Fengting looked back. In his sight, Situ Songyue, who was in a white dress and covered in blood, fell from her seat. She clenched her hands and struggled to stand up. But her injury was too serious to stand up. In the end, she chose to kneel on the ground. She knelt in front of Lin Fengting. The hidden god of Zhongzhou state, who had been extremely proud all her life, tried to kneel there, with blood flowing and tears streaming down her face. Please, she looked at the picture on the screen. In the picture, the rain of blood was flying. Li Tianlan's figure was swaying. Situ Songyue's eyes fell on Lin Fengting. That was the weakness and pleading after giving up all dignity and honor. She was weak but very real. Please save her, please. Her body was trembling, and her head was getting lower and lower. Lin Fengting took a step forward, and also knelt in front of Situ Songyue. His eyes were calm, but there was an undisguised bitter smile on his face. Your Highness, you're too serious. I can't afford such a big bow. Get up first. Get up first. Situ Songyue grabbed Lin Fengting's wrist with all her strength. She shook her head and repeated, please save him. I can't do it tonight. Lin Fengting's voice was apologetic. But I can assure you that Tianlan will be fine. Situ Songyue looked at Lin Fengting in a daze. Her eyes were black and white, and finally they completely turned into hatred. You have the ability to save him. Why not? Why? Why? At this moment, Situ Songyue hated Lin Fengting very much. It was unreasonable, and she didn't want to be reasonable. She hated all those who had the ability to help Li Tianlan but stood by. Governor, you've done enough tonight. Next, you should have a good rest. But Tianlan hasn't done anything yet. Lin Fengting said softly. He's still a child. Situ Songyue said word by word. Her voice was hoarse, and blood flowed from the corner of her mouth. She stared into Lin Fengting's eyes. What can he do now? He can't kill anyone. Lin Fengting was silent for a while and said slowly, but at least he cannot retreat. In front of him were 5 invincible realm experts, monstrous waves, infinite mountains, violent storms, lightning flashes and thunder. But Li Tianlan could not retreat. Because behind him was the real abyss, silent as the eternal night. Tonight's matter is not something we can intervene in. Lin Fengting patted Situ Songyue's palm and said calmly, this is the Li family's own business. He would not make a move, because he had promised Qin Weibai that he would hide a sword at the peak. The Snowdance Corps was also watching the scene on the battlefield. In the scene, Li Tianlan was sent flying again and again. He was covered in blood, but he still moved forward. It had nothing to do with reason, nor was it about cleverness or stupidity. Standing in this position, even if he were to die, he could only move forward. More and more elites of the Snowdance Corps saw this scene. The scene finally appeared on the square in front of the office of the president. The wind and rain were endless. There was silence under the wind and rain. Everyone in the Snowdance Corps was watching this scene. Their bodies gradually tightened. Everyone stared at the figure of Li Tianlan being sent flying again and again on the screen. The summer rain in Eastern Europe was as cold as ice. But a violent atmosphere rose in silence, rising when Li Tianlan was sent flying again and again. The entire office of the president seemed to have become a real volcano. There was a kind of strong and crazy fighting intent and humiliation everywhere. Lightning cut through the sky. Thunder suddenly rose. A clear and sharp sword light suddenly flashed behind the office of the president. The sword light went all the way north. The north was the battlefield. Everyone subconsciously glanced at the sword light. The sword light was so clear and so quiet. That was the sword of Jade Pool. The entire Snowdance Corps seemed to be completely ignited by this sword light in an instant. There were no high-level officials in the Snowdance Corps. But countless roars rang out at the same time. The roar, like that of a demon, shook heaven and earth and resounded throughout the city. Kill them! Kill them! There was no hesitation or even mobilization. Under the wind and rain, there were many twisted faces that were enraged to the extreme. The footsteps rumbled. It was like thunder. All the soldiers of the Snowdance Corps picked up their weapons at this moment and followed the sword light to the north without hesitation. On the battlefield north of the office of the president, the marshal they had sworn to follow was being humiliated. Zhongzhou State. They were being humiliated. The defense of the office of the president was no longer important. It didn't matter whether they could kill a few invincible realm experts or not. Even if they died, they were going to die on the battlefield in the north. They were impassioned. Without the leadership of the high-level officials, the Snowdance Corps was like a torrent that could destroy everything, rushing forward under the wind, rain, and light. In the office of the president, Wang Tianzong stood in front of his window and looked at the outside world. He was silent for a long time. There was no Snowdance Corps here, and he was no longer confined. But he never left. In the chaotic footsteps, the last few soldiers of the Snowdance Corps rushed over. They suddenly stopped and looked at Wang Tianzong. Wang Tianzong also looked at them with an indifferent expression. The faces of several soldiers of the Snowdance Corps were also cold. They were all the most ordinary soldiers. The one with the highest military rank was nearly 40 years old, but he was only a captain. His martial cultivation had just reached the ice-condensing realm. In the face of the invincible realm experts, the Snowdance Corps, who respected the strong, used to show full respect. In the face of the invincible Sword Emperor, even if they were enemies, the Snowdance Corps still did not neglect him. But at this moment, the eyes of this small team of soldiers of the Snowdance Corps were completely full of indifference and contempt when they looked at Wang Tianzong. "Your Majesty, Sword Emperor." The captain in the lead suddenly stretched out his hand and pointed to the north. Just more than 10 kilometers away, Marshal Li is facing 5 invincible realm experts in the dark world alone. He won't be their match. But he won't retreat. The Snowdance Corps won't be their match either, but we won't retreat either. Because each of us knows that once we retreat tonight, it means that Zhongzhou State has given up Wulan State and Eastern Europe, which means that we have given up too many national interests. If Marshal Li doesn't retreat, we won't retreat either. He looked at Wang Tianzong and roared. "What about you? I heard that His Majesty's sword energy can move 10,000 meters high. When countless people in Zhongzhou State are fighting for the interests of Zhongzhou State, what the hell are you doing as the Sword Emperor of Zhongzhou State?" Wang Tianzong narrowed his eyes and looked at the most ordinary officer in the Snowdance Corps, who was at the basic level, without saying a word. The captain looked at Wang Tianzong for a while and suddenly sneered. "Bah!" He spat at Wang Tianzong's window. The captain turned around and left. "Damn the Sword Emperor of Zhongzhou State." That you're tuning in to the Echoes of the Heart YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.